Part 3rd of Nostromo by Joseph Conrad. The Lighthouse, Chapter 10. This librivox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dann. Part 3rd, The Lighthouse, Chapter 10. The next day was quiet in the morning, except for the faint sound of firing to the northward in the direction of Los Hatos. Captain Mitchell had listened to it from his balcony anxiously. The phrase, "in my delicate position as the only consular agent then in the port, everything, sir, everything," was a just cause for anxiety, had its place in the more or less stereotyped relation of the historical events, which for the next few years was at the service of distinguished strangers visiting Sulaco. The mention of the dignity and neutrality of the flag, so difficult to preserve in his position, right in the thick of these events, between the lawlessness of that piratical villain Sotillo and the more regularly established but scarcely less atrocious tyranny of His Excellency Don Pedro Montero, came next in order. Captain Mitchell was not the man to enlarge upon mere dangers much, but he insisted that it was a memorable day. On that day, towards dusk, he had seen "that poor fellow of mine, Nostromo, the sailor whom I discovered, and I may say made, sir, the man of the famous ride to Caïta, sir, an historical event, sir." Regarded by the OSN Company as an old and faithful servant, Captain Mitchell was allowed to attain the term of his usefulness in ease and dignity at the head of the enormously extended service. The augmentation of the establishment, with its crowds of clerks, an office in town, the old office in the harbour, the division into departments, passenger, cargo, lighterage, and so on, secured a greater leisure for his last years in the regenerated Sulaco, the capital of the Occidental Republic. Liked by the natives for his good nature and the formality of his manner, self-important and simple, known for years as a friend of our country, he felt himself a personality of mark in the town. Getting up early for a turn in the marketplace while the gigantic shadow of Higuerota was still lying upon the fruit and flower stalls piled up with masses of gorgeous colouring, attending easily to current affairs, welcomed in houses, greeted by ladies on the Alameda, with his entry into all the clubs and a footing in the Casa Gould, he led his privileged old bachelor man-about-town existence with great comfort and solemnity. But on mailboat days he was down at the harbour office at an early hour, with his own gig manned by a smart crew in white and blue, ready to dash off and board the ship directly she showed her bows between the harbour heads. It would be into the harbour office that he would lead some privileged passenger he had brought off in his own boat, and invite him to take a seat for a moment while he signed a few papers. And Captain Mitchell, seating himself at his desk, would keep on talking hospitably. "There isn't much time if you're to see everything in a day. We should be off in a moment. We'll have lunch at the Amarilla Club, though I belong also to the Anglo-American, mining engineers and businessmen, don't you know? And at the Miraflores as well, a new club, English, French, Italians, all sorts. Lively young fellows mostly, who wanted to pay a compliment to an old resident, sir. But we'll lunch at the Amarilla. Interest you, I fancy. Real thing of the country, men of the first families. The President of the Occidental Republic himself belongs to it, sir. Fine old bishop with a broken nose in the patio. Remarkable piece of statuary, I believe. Cavaliere Paracetti, you know. Paracetti, the famous Italian sculptor, was working here for 2 years. Thought very highly of our old bishop. There, I'm very much at your service now." Proud of his experience, penetrated by a sense of historical importance of men, events and buildings, he talked pompously in jerky periods, with slight sweeps of his short thick arm, letting nothing escape the attention of his privileged captive. "Lots of building going on, as you observe. Before the separation it was a plain of burnt grass smothered in clouds of dust, with an ox-cart track to our jetty, nothing more. This is the harbour gate. Picturesque, is it not? Formerly the town stopped short there. We enter now the Calle de la Constitution. Observe the old Spanish houses. Great dignity, eh? I suppose it's just as it was in the time of the viceroys, except for the pavement. Wood blocks now. Sulaco National Bank there, with the sentry boxes each side of the gate. Casa Avellanos this side, with all the ground floor windows shuttered. A wonderful woman lives there, Miss Avellanos, the beautiful Antonia. A character, sir, a historical woman. Opposite, Casa Gould, noble gateway. Yes, the Goulds of the original Gould concession that all the world knows of now. I hold 17 of the $1,000 shares of the consolidated San Tome mines, all the poor savings of my lifetime, sir, and it will be enough to keep me in comfort to the end of my days at home when I retire. I got in on the ground floor, you see. Don Carlos, great friend of mine, 17 shares. Quite a little fortune to leave behind one, too. I have a niece, married a parson, most worthy man, incumbent of a small parish in Sussex, no end of children. I was never married myself. A sailor should exercise self-denial. Standing under that very gateway, sir, with some young fellow engineers, ready to defend that house where we had received so much kindness and hospitality, I saw the first and last charge of Pedrito's horsemen upon Barrios's troops, who had just taken the harbour gate. They could not stand the new rifles brought out by that poor Decoud. It was a murderous fire. In a moment the street became blocked with a mass of dead men and horses. They never came on again. And all day Captain Mitchell would talk like this to his more or less willing victim. The Plaza, I call it magnificent, twice the area of Trafalgar Square. From the very centre in the blazing sunshine he pointed out the buildings. The Intendencia, now President's Palace, Cabildo, where the lower chamber of Parliament sits. You notice the new houses on that side of the plaza? Campagna Anzani, a great general store like those cooperative things at home. Old Anzani was murdered by the National Guards in front of his safe. It was even for that specific crime that the Deputy Gamacho, commanding the Nationals, a bloodthirsty and savage brute, was executed publicly by garrote upon the sentence of a court-martial ordered by Barrios. Anzani's nephews converted the business into a company. All that side of the plaza had been burnt, used to be colonnaded before. A terrible fire, by the light of which I saw the last of the fighting, the llaneros flying, the Nationals throwing their arms down, and the miners of San Tome, all Indians from the Sierra, rolling by like a torrent to the sound of pipes and cymbals, green flags flying, a wild mass of men in white ponchos and green hats, on foot, on mules, on donkeys. Such a sight, sir, will never be seen again. The miners, sir, had marched upon the town, Don Pepe leading on his black horse, and their very wives in the rear on burros, screaming encouragement, sir, and beating tambourines. I remember one of these women had a green parrot seated on her shoulder, as calm as a bird of stone. They had just saved their Senor Administrador, for Barrios, though he ordered the assault at once, at night too, would have been too late. Pedrito Montero had Don Carlos led out to be shot, like his uncle many years ago, and then, as Barrios said afterwards, Sulaco would not have been worth fighting for. Sulaco, without the concession, was nothing, and there were tons and tons of dynamite distributed all over the mountain with detonators arranged, and an old priest, Father Roman, standing by to annihilate the San Tome mine at the first news of failure. Don Carlos had made up his mind not to leave it behind, and he had the right men to see to it too. Thus Captain Mitchell would talk in the middle of the plaza, holding over his head a white umbrella with a green lining. But inside the cathedral, in the dim light, with a faint scent of incense floating in the cool atmosphere, and here and there a kneeling female figure, black or all white, with a veiled head, his lowered voice became solemn and impressive. Here, he would say, pointing to a niche in the wall of the dusky aisle, you see the bust of Don José Avellanos, patriot and statesman, as the inscription says, minister to courts of England and Spain, etc., etc., died in the woods of Los Hatos, worn out with his lifelong struggle for right and justice at the dawn of the new era. A fair likeness. Parachetti's work from some old photographs and a pencil sketch by Mrs. Gould. I was well acquainted with that distinguished Spanish-American of the old school, a true Hidalgo, beloved by everybody who knew him. The marble medallion in the wall in the antique style, representing a veiled woman seated with her hands clasped loosely over her knees, commemorates that unfortunate young gentleman who sailed out with Nostromo on that fateful night, sir. See, to the memory of Martin Decoud, his betrothed Antonia Avellanos. Frank, simple, noble. There you have that lady, sir, as she is. An exceptional woman. Those who thought she would give way to despair were mistaken, sir. She has been blamed in many quarters for not having taken the veil. It was expected of her. But Donna Antonia is not the stuff they make nuns of. Bishop Corbelan, her uncle, lives with her in the Corbelan townhouse. He's a fierce sort of priest, everlastingly worrying the government about the old church lands and convents. I believe they think a lot of him in Rome. Now let us go to the Amarilla Club, just across the Plaza, to get some lunch. Directly outside the cathedral, on the very top of the noble flight of steps, his voice rose pompously. His arm found again its sweeping gesture. Porvenir, over there, on that first floor, above those French plate-glass shop fronts, our biggest daily. Conservative, or rather, I should say, parliamentary. We have the parliamentary party here, of which the actual chief of the state, Don Juste Lopez, is the head. A very sagacious man, I think, a first-rate intellect, sir. The Democratic Party in opposition rests mostly, I'm sorry to say, on these socialistic Italians, sir, with their secret societies, Camorras and the like. There are a lot of Italians settled here on the railway lands, dismissed navvies, mechanics and so on, all along the trunk line. There are whole villages of Italians on the Campo. And the natives, too, are being drawn into these ways. American bar, yes, and over there you can see another. New Yorkers mostly frequent that one. Here we are, at the Amarilla. Observe the bishop at the foot of the stairs to the right as we go in. And the lunch would begin and terminate its lavish and leisurely course at a little table in the gallery, Captain Mitchell nodding, bowing, getting up to speak for a moment to different officials in black clothes, merchants in jackets, officers in uniform, middle-aged caballeros from the Campo, sallow, little, nervous men, and fat, placid, swarthy men, and Europeans or North Americans of superior standing, whose faces looked very white amongst the majority of dark complexions and black glistening eyes. Captain Mitchell would lie back in the chair, casting around looks of satisfaction, and tender over the table a case full of thick cigars. Try a weed with your coffee. Local tobacco. The black coffee you get at the Amarilla, sir, you don't meet anywhere in the world. We get the bean from a famous cafeteria in the foothills, whose owner sends 3 sacks every year as a present to his fellow members in remembrance of the fight against Camacho's nationals, carried on from these very windows by the caballeros. He was in town at the time and took part, sir, to the bitter end. It arrives on 3 mules, not in the common way by rail, no fear, right into the patio, escorted by mounted peons in charge of the mayoral of his estate, who walks upstairs booted and spurred and delivers it to our committee formally with the words, "For the sake of those fallen on the 3rd of May. We call it Tres de Mayo coffee. Taste it." Captain Mitchell, with an expression as though making ready to hear a sermon in a church, would lift the tiny cup to his lips, and the nectar would be sipped to the bottom during a restful silence in a cloud of cigar smoke. "Look at this man in black just going out," he would begin, leaning forward hastily. "This is the famous Hernandez, Minister of War, the Times special correspondent who wrote that striking series of letters calling the Occidental Republic the treasure house of the world, gave a whole article to him and the force he has organised, the renowned Carabineers of the Campo." Captain Mitchell's guest, staring curiously, would see a figure in a long-tailed black coat, walking gravely, with downcast eyelids in a long, composed face, a brow furrowed horizontally, a pointed head, whose grey hair, thin at the top, combed down carefully on all sides and rolled at the ends, fell low on the neck and shoulders. This, then, was the famous bandit of whom Europe had heard with interest. He put on a high-crowned sombrero with a wide flat brim. A rosary of wooden beads was twisted about his right wrist. And Captain Mitchell would proceed, "The protector of the Sulaco refugees from the rage of Pedrito. As general of cavalry with Barrios, he distinguished himself at the storming of Tonoro, where Senor Fuentes was killed with the last remnant of the Monterists. He is the friend and humble servant of Bishop Corbelin. He has 3 masses every day. I bet you he will step into the cathedral to say a prayer or 2 on his way home to his siesta." He took several puffs at his cigar in silence, and then, in his most important manner, pronounced, "The Spanish race, sir, is prolific of remarkable characters in every rank of life. I propose we go now into the billiard-room, which is cool, for a quiet chat. There's never anybody there till after 5. I could tell you episodes of the Separationist Revolution that would astonish you. When the great heat's over, we'll take a turn on the Almeida." The programme went on relentless like a law of nature. The turn on the Almeida was taken with slow steps and stately remarks. "All the great world of Sulaco here, sir," Captain Mitchell bowed right and left with no end of formality, and then with animation, Donna Amarilla, Mrs. Gould's carriage, look, always white mules, the kindest, most gracious woman the sun ever shone upon. A great position, sir, a great position. First lady in Sulaco, far before the president's wife, and worthy of it." He took off his hat then, with a studied change of tone, added negligently that the man in black by her side, with a high white collar and a scarred, snarly face, was Dr. Monningham, Inspector of State Hospitals, Chief Medical Officer of the Consolidated San Tome Mines. "A familiar of the house, everlastingly there. No wonder. The Goulds made him. Very clever man and all that, but I never liked him. Nobody does. I can recollect him limping about the streets in a check shirt and native sandals with a watermelon under his arm, all he would get to eat for the day. A bigwig now, sir, and as nasty as ever. However, there's no doubt he played his part fairly well at the time. He saved us all from the deadly incubus of Sotillo, where a more particular man might have failed." His arm went up. "The equestrian statue that used to stand on the pedestal over there has been removed. It was an anachronism," Captain Mitchell commented obscurely. "There is some talk of replacing it by a marble shaft commemorative of separation, with angels of peace at the four corners and bronze justice holding up an even balance, all gilt on the top. Cavaliere Paracetti was asked to make a design which you can see framed under glass in the municipal sala. Names are to be engraved all round the base. Well, they could do no better than begin with the name of Nostromo. He has done for separation as much as anybody else, and, added Captain Mitchell, has got less than many others by it when it comes to that." He dropped on to a stone seat under a tree and tapped invitingly at the place by his side. "He carried to Barrios the letters from Sulaco which decided the general to abandon Caïta for a time and come back to our help here by sea. The transports were still in harbour, fortunately. Sir, I did not even know that my Capataz de Cargadores was alive. I had no idea. It was Dr. Monningham who came upon him, by chance, in the custom-house, evacuated an hour or two before by the wretched Sotillo. I was never told, never given a hint, nothing, as if I were unworthy of confidence. Monningham arranged it all. He went to the railway yards and got admission to the engineer-in-chief, who, for the sake of the Goulds as much as for anything else, consented to let an engine make a dash down the line, 180 miles, with Nostromo aboard. It was the only way to get him off. In the construction camp at the railhead he obtained a horse, arms, some clothing, and started alone on that marvellous ride, 400 miles in 6 days through a disturbed country, ending by the feat of passing through the Monterist lines outside Caïta. The history of that ride, sir, would make a most exciting book. He carried all our lives in his pocket. Devotion, courage, fidelity, intelligence were not enough. Of course, he was perfectly fearless and incorruptible, but a man was wanted that would know how to succeed. He was that man, sir. On the 5th of May, being practically a prisoner in the harbour office of my company, I suddenly heard the whistle of an engine in the railway yards, a quarter of a mile away. I could not believe my ears. I made one jump onto the balcony and beheld a locomotive under a great head of steam run out of the yard gates, screeching like mad, enveloped in a white cloud, and then just abreast of old Viola's Inn, check almost to a standstill. I made out, sir, a man, I couldn't tell who, dash out of the Albergo d'Italia Una, climb into the cab, and then, sir, that engine seemed positively to leap clear of the house, and was gone in the twinkling of an eye, as you blow a candle out, sir. There was a first-rate driver on the footplate, sir, I can tell you. They were fired heavily upon by the National Guards in Rinson and one other place. Fortunately, the line had not been torn up. In 4 hours they reached the construction camp. Nostromo had his start. The rest you know. You've only got to look around you. There are people on this Almeida that ride in their carriages or even are alive at all today because years ago I engaged a runaway Italian sailor for a foreman of our wharf simply on the strength of his looks. And that's a fact. You can't get over it, sir. On the 17th of May, just 12 days after I saw the man from the Casa Viola get on the engine and wondered what it meant, Barrios's transports were entering this harbour, and the treasure house of the world, as the Times man calls Sulaco in his book, was saved intact for civilization, for a great future, sir. Pedrito, with Hernandez on the west and the San Tome miners pressing on the land gate, was not able to oppose the landing. He had been sending messages to Sotillo for a week to join him. Had Sir Theo done so, there would have been massacres and proscription that would have left no man or woman of position alive. But that's where Dr. Monningham comes in. Sir Theo, blind and deaf to everything, stuck on board his steamer, watching the dragging for silver which he believed to be sunk at the bottom of the harbour. They say that for the last 3 days he was out of his mind, raving and foaming with disappointment at getting nothing, flying about the deck, yelling curses at the boats with the drags, ordering them in, and then suddenly stamping his foot and crying out, "And yet it is there! I see it! I feel it!" He was preparing to hang Dr. Monningham, whom he had on board, at the end of the after-derrick, when the first of Barrios's transports, one of our own ships at that, steamed right in, and ranging close alongside opened a small arm fire without as much preliminaries as a hail. It was the completest surprise in the world, sir. They were too astounded at first to bolt below. Men were falling right and left like ninepins. It's a miracle that Monningham, standing in the after hatch with the rope already round his neck, escaped being riddled through and through like a sieve. He told me since that he had given himself up for lost, and kept on yelling with all the strength of his lungs, "Hoist a white flag! Hoist a white flag!" Suddenly an old major of the Esmeralda regiment, standing by, unsheathed his sword with a shriek, "Die, perjured traitor!" and ran Sir Theo clean through the body, just before he fell himself, shot through the head. Captain Mitchell stopped for a while. "Begad, sir, I could spin you a yarn for hours. But it's time we started off a rinse-on. It would not do for you to pass through Sulaco and not see the lights of the San Tome mine, a whole mountain ablaze like a lighted palace above the dark Campo. It's a fashionable drive. But let me tell you one little anecdote, sir, just to show you. A fortnight or more later, when Barrios, declared generalissimo, was gone in pursuit of Pedrito away south, when the provisional junta, with Don Juste Lopez at its head, had promulgated the new constitution, and our Don Carlos Gould was packing up his trunks, bound on a mission to San Francisco and Washington. The United States, sir, were the first great power to recognise the Occidental Republic. A fortnight later, I say, when we were beginning to feel that our heads were safe on our shoulders, if I may express myself so, a prominent man, a large shipper by our line, came to see me on business, and says he, the first thing, "I say, Captain Mitchell, is that fellow," meaning Nostromo, "still the capataz of your cargadores or not?" "What's the matter?" says I. "Because if he is, then I don't mind. I send and receive a good lot of cargo by your ships, but I have observed him several days loafing about the wharf, and just now he stopped me as cool as you please with a request for a cigar. Now, you know my cigars are rather special, and I can't get them so easily as all that." "I hope you stretched a point," I said very gently. "Why, yes, but it's a confounded nuisance. The fellow's everlastingly cadging for smokes." "Sir," I turned my eyes away and then asked, "Weren't you one of the prisoners and the Cabildo?" "You know very well I was, and in chains too," says he. "And under a fine of $15,000? He coloured, sir, because it got about that he fainted from fright when they came to arrest him, and then behaved before Fuentes in a manner to make the very Ponlicianos, who had dragged him there by the hair of his head, smile at his cringing. 'Yes,' he says in a sort of shy way. 'Why?' 'Oh, nothing. You stood to lose a tidy bit,' says I, 'even if you saved your life. But what can I do for you?' He never even saw the point, not he. And that's how the world wags, sir." He rose a little stiffly, and the drive to Rinson would be taken with only one philosophical remark, uttered by the merciless Cicerone, with his eyes fixed upon the lights of San Tome, that seemed suspended in the dark night between earth and heaven. "A great power, this, for good and evil, sir. A great power." And the dinner of the Miraflores would be eaten, excellent as to cooking, and leaving upon the traveller's mind an impression that there were in Sulaco many pleasant, able young men with salaries apparently too large for their discretion, and amongst them a few, mostly Anglo-Saxon, skilled in the art of, as the saying is, taking a rise out of his kind host. With a rapid, jingling drive to the harbour in a two-wheeled machine, which Captain Mitchell called a curricle, behind a fleet and scraggy mule beaten all the time by an obviously Neapolitan driver, the cycle would be nearly closed before the lighted-up offices of the OSN Company, remaining open so late because of the steamer. Nearly, but not quite. 10 o'clock. Your ship won't be ready to leave till 12:30, if by then. Come in for a brandy and soda and one more cigar. And in the superintendent's private room, the privileged passenger by the Ceres or Juno or Pallas, stunned and, as it were, annihilated mentally by a sudden surfeit of sighs, sounds, names, facts, and complicated information imperfectly apprehended, would listen like a tired child to a fairy tale, would hear a voice familiar and surprising in its pompousness tell him, as if from another world, how there was, in this very harbour, an international naval demonstration which put an end to the Costaguana-Sulaco War. How the United States cruiser Powhatan was the first to salute the Occidental flag, white with a wreath of green laurel in the middle, encircling a yellow Amarilla flower. Would hear how General Montero, in less than a month after proclaiming himself Emperor of Costaguana, was shot dead during a solemn and public distribution of orders and crosses by a young artillery officer, the brother of his then mistress. "The abominable Pedrito, sir, fled the country," the voice would say. And it would continue, "A captain of one of our ships told me lately that he recognized Pedrito the guerrero, arrayed in purple slippers and a velvet smoking cap with a gold tassel, keeping a disorderly house in one of the southern ports." Abominable Pedrito! Who the devil was he, would wonder the distinguished bird of passage, hovering on the confines of waking and sleep, with resolutely opened eyes and a faint but amiable curl upon his lips, from between which stuck out the 18th or 20th cigar of that memorable day. "He appeared to me in this very room like a haunting ghost, sir." Captain Mitchell was talking of his Nostromo, with true warmth of feeling and a touch of wistful pride. "You may imagine, sir, what an effect it produced on me. He had come round by sea with Barrios, of course, and the first thing he told me, after I became fit to hear him, was that he had picked up the lighter's boat floating in the Gulf. He seemed quite overcome by the circumstance, and a remarkable enough circumstance it was, when you remember that it was then 16 days since the sinking of the Silver. At once I could see he was another man. He stared at the wall, sir, as if there had been a spider or something running about there. The loss of the Silver preyed on his mind. The first thing he asked me about was whether Donna Antonia had heard yet of Decoud's death. His voice trembled. I had to tell him that Donna Antonia, as a matter of fact, was not back in town yet. Poor girl. And just as I was making ready to ask him 1,000 questions, with a sudden, "Pardon me, senor," he cleared out of the office altogether. I did not see him again for 3 days. I was terribly busy, you know. It seems that he wandered about in and out of the town, and on 2 nights turned up to sleep in the barracoons of the railway people. He seemed absolutely indifferent to what went on. I asked him on the wharf, "When are you going to take hold again, Nostromo? There will be plenty of work for the cargadores presently." "Senor," says he, looking at me in a slow, inquisitive manner, "would it surprise you to hear that I am too tired to work just yet? And what work could I do now? How can I look my cargadores in the face after losing a lighter?" I begged him not to think any more about the Silver, and he smiled, a smile that went to my heart, sir. It was no mistake, I told him. It was a fatality, a thing that could not be helped. See, he said, and turned away. I thought it best to leave him alone for a bit to get over it. Sir, took him years really to get over it. I was present at his interview with Don Carlos. I must say that Gould is rather a cold man. He had to keep a tight hand on his feelings, dealing with thieves and rascals, in constant danger of ruin for himself and wife for so many years that it had become a second nature. They looked at each other for a long time. Don Carlos asked what he could do for him in his quiet, reserved way. "My name is known from one end of Sulaco to the other," he said, as quiet as the other. "What more can you do for me?" That was all that passed on that occasion. Later on, however, there was a very fine coasting schooner for sale, and Mrs. Gould and I put our heads together to get her bought and presented to him. It was done, but he paid all the price back within the next 3 years. Business was booming all along this seaboard, sir. Moreover, that man always succeeded in everything except in saving the Silver. Poor Donna Antonia, fresh from her terrible experience in the woods at Las Hartos, had an interview with him too, wanted to hear about Decoud, what they said, what they did, what they thought up to the last on that fatal night. Mrs. Gould told me his manner was perfect for quietness and sympathy. Miss Avellanos burst into tears only when he told her how Decoud had happened to say that his plan would be a glorious success. And there's no doubt, sir, that it is. It is a success. The cycle was about to close at last, and while the privileged passenger, shivering with the pleasant anticipation of his berth, forgot to ask himself what on earth Decoud's plan could be, Captain Mitchell was saying, "Sorry we must part so soon. Your intelligent interest made this a pleasant day for me. I shall see you now on board. You had a glimpse of the treasure house of the world. A very good name, that." And the coxswain's voice at the door announcing that the gig was ready closed the cycle. Nostromo had indeed found the lighter's boat, which he had left on the Great Isabel with Decoud, floating empty far out in the Gulf. He was then on the bridge of the first of Barrios's transports, and within an hour's steaming from Sulaco. Barrios, always delighted with a feat of daring and a good judge of courage, had taken a great liking to the Capataz. During the passage round the coast, the general kept Nostromo near his person, addressing him frequently in that abrupt and boisterous manner which was the sign of his high favour. Nostromo's eyes were the first to catch, broad on the bow, the tiny, elusive dark speck, which alone with the forms of the three Isabels right ahead appeared on the flat, shimmering emptiness of the Gulf. There are times when no fact should be neglected as insignificant. A small boat, so far from the land, might have had some meaning worth finding out. At a nod of consent from Barrios, the transport swept out of her course, passing near enough to ascertain that no one manned the little cockle-shell. It was merely a common small boat gone adrift with her oars in her. But Nostromo, to whose mind Decoud had been insistently present for days, had long before recognised with excitement the dinghy of the lighter. There could be no question of stopping to pick up that thing. Every minute of time was momentous with the lives and futures of a whole town. The head of the leading ship, with the general on board, fell off to her course. Behind her, the fleet of transports, scattered haphazard over a mile or so in the offing, like the finish of an ocean race, pressed on, all black and smoking on the western sky. "Mi general," Nostromo's voice rang out loud, but quiet, from behind a group of officers. "I should like to save that little boat. Por Dios, I know her. She belongs to my company." "And por Dios," guffawed Barrios in a noisy, good-humoured voice, "you belong to me. I am going to make you a captain of cavalry directly we get within sight of our horse again." "I can swim far better than I can ride, mi general," cried Nostromo, pushing through to the rail with a set stare in his eyes. "Let me." "Let you? What a conceited fellow that is," bantered the general jovially, without even looking at him. "Let him go. Ha ha ha! He wants me to admit that we cannot take Sulaco without him. Ha ha ha! Would you like to swim after her, my son?" A tremendous shout from one end of the ship to the other stopped his guffaw. Nostromo had leapt overboard, and his black head bobbed up, far away already from the ship. The general muttered an appalled "Cielo, sinner that I am," in a thunderstruck tone. One anxious glance was enough to show him that Nostromo was swimming with perfect ease, and then he thundered terribly, "No, no, we shall not stop to pick up this impertinent fellow. Let him drown, that mad Capataz." Nothing short of main force would have kept Nostromo from leaping overboard. That empty boat, coming out to meet him mysteriously, as if rowed by an invisible spectre, exercised the fascination of some sign, of some warning, seemed to answer in a startling and enigmatic way the persistent thought of a treasure and of a man's fate. He would have leapt if there had been death in that half-mile of water. It was as smooth as a pond, and for some reason sharks are unknown in the placid Gulf, though on the other side of the Punta Mala the coastline swarms with them. The Capataz seized hold of the stern and blew with force. A queer, quaint feeling had come over him while he swam. He had got rid of his boots and coat in the water. He hung on for a time, regaining his breath. In the distance, the transports, more in a bunch now, held on straight for Sulaco, with their air of friendly contest, of nautical sport, of a regatta, and the united smoke of their funnels drove like a thin, sulphurous fog-bank right over his head. It was his daring, his courage, his act that had set these ships in motion upon the sea, hurrying on to save the lives and fortunes of the Blancos, the taskmasters of the people, to save the San Tome mine, to save the children. With a vigorous and skilful effort he clambered over the stern. The very boat, no doubt of it, no doubt whatever. It was the dinghy of the lighter number 3. The dinghy left with Martin Decoud on the Great Isabel so that he should have some means to help himself if nothing could be done for him from the shore. And here she had come out to meet him, empty and inexplicable. What had become of Decoud? The Capataz made a minute examination. He looked for some scratch, for some mark, for some sign. All he discovered was a brown stain on the gunwale abreast of the thwart. He bent his face over it and rubbed hard with his finger. Then he sat down in the stern sheets, passive, with his knees close together and legs aslant. Streaming from head to foot, with his hair and whiskers hanging lank and dripping, and a lustreless stare fixed upon the bottom boards, the Capataz of the Sulaco Cargadores resembled a drowned corpse come up from the bottom to idle away the sunset hour in a small boat. The excitement of his adventurous ride, the excitement of the return in time, of achievement, of success, all this excitement centred around the associated ideas of the great treasure, and of the only other man who knew of its existence, had departed from him. To the very last moment he had been cudgelling his brains as to how he could manage to visit the Great Isabel without loss of time and undetected, for the idea of secrecy had come to be connected with the treasure so closely that even to Barrios himself he had refrained from mentioning the existence of Decoud and of the silver on the island. The letters he carried to the General, however, made brief mention of the loss of the lighter as having its bearing upon the situation in Sulaco. In the circumstances, the one-eyed tiger-slayer, scenting battle from afar, had not wasted his time in making inquiries from the messenger. In fact, Barrios, talking with Nostromo, assumed that both Don Martin Decoud and the ingots of San Tome were lost altogether, and Nostromo, not questioned directly, had kept silent, under the influence of some indefinable form of resentment and distrust. Let Don Martin speak of everything with his own lips, was what he told himself mentally. And now, with the means of gaining the Great Isabel thrown thus in his way at the earliest possible moment, his excitement had departed, as when the soul takes flight, leaving the body inert upon an earth it knows no more. Nostromo did not seem to know the gulf. For a long time even his eyelids did not flutter once upon the glazed emptiness of his stare. Then slowly, without a limb having stirred, without a twitch of muscle or quiver of an eyelash, an expression, a living expression, came upon the still features. Deep thought crept into the empty stare, as if an outcast soul, a quiet, brooding soul, finding that untenanted body in its way, had come in stealthily to take possession. The Capataz frowned, and in the immense stillness of sea, islands and coast, of cloud forms on the sky and trails of light upon the water, the knitting of that brow had the emphasis of a powerful gesture. Nothing else budged for a long time. Then the Capataz shook his head and again surrendered himself to the universal repose of all visible things. Suddenly he seized the oars and with one movement made the dinghy spin around, head on to the Great Isabel. But before he began to pull, he bent once more over the brown stain on the gunwale. "I know that thing," he muttered to himself with a sagacious jerk of the head. "That's blood." His stroke was long, vigorous and steady. Now and then he looked over his shoulder at the Great Isabel, presenting its low cliff to his anxious gaze like an impenetrable face. At last the stem touched the strand. He flung rather than dragged the boat up the little beach. At once, turning his back upon the sunset, he plunged with long strides into the ravine, making the water of the stream spurt and fly upward at every step, as if spurning its shallow, clear, murmuring spirit with his feet. He wanted to save every moment of daylight. A mass of earth, grass and smashed bushes had fallen down very naturally from above upon the cavity under the leaning tree. Decoud had attended to the concealment of the silver as instructed, using the spade with some intelligence. But Nostromo's half-smile of approval changed into a scornful curl of the lip by the sight of the spade itself flung there in full view, as if in utter carelessness or sudden panic, giving away the whole thing. They were all alike in their folly, these hombres finos that invented laws and governments and barren tasks for the people. The Capitas picked up the spade, and with the feel of the handle in his palm, the desire of having a look at the horsehide boxes of treasure came upon him suddenly. In a very few strokes he uncovered the edges and corners of several, then, clearing away more earth, became aware that one of them had been slashed with a knife. He exclaimed at that discovery in a stifled voice, and dropped on his knees with a look of irrational apprehension over one shoulder, then over the other. The stiff hide had closed, and he hesitated before he pushed his hand through the long slit and felt the ingots inside. There they were, 1, 2, 3, yes, 4 gone, taken away. 4 ingots. But who? Decoud? Nobody else. And why? For what purpose? For what cursed fantasy? Let him explain. 4 ingots carried off in a boat, and blood. In the face of the open gulf, the sun, clear, unclouded, unaltered, plunged into the waters in a grave and untroubled mystery of self-immolation, consummated far from all mortal eyes, with an infinite majesty of silence and peace. 4 ingots short, and blood. The Capitas got up slowly. "He might simply have cut his hand," he muttered, "but then—" He sat down on the soft earth, unresisting, as if he had been chained to the treasure, his drawn-up legs clasped in his hands with an air of hopeless submission, like a slave set on guard. Once only he lifted his head smartly. The rattle of hot musketry fire had reached his ears like pouring from on high a stream of dry peas upon a drum. After listening for a while, he said, half aloud, "He will never come back to explain." And he lowered his head again. "Impossible," he muttered gloomily. The sounds of firing died out. The loom of a great conflagration in Sulaco flashed up red above the coast, played on the clouds at the head of the gulf, seemed to touch with a ruddy and sinister reflection the forms of the 3 Isabels. He never saw it, though he raised his head. "But then I cannot know," he pronounced distinctly, and remained silent and staring for hours. He could not know. Nobody was to know. As might have been supposed, the end of Don Martin Decoud never became a subject of speculation for anyone except Nostromo. Had the truth of the facts been known, there would always have remained the question, why? Whereas the version of his death at the sinking of the lighter had no uncertainty of motive. The young apostle of separation had died striving for his idea by an ever-lamented accident. But the truth was that he died from solitude, the enemy known but to few on this earth, and whom only the simplest of us are fit to withstand. The brilliant Costaguanero of the boulevards had died from solitude and want of faith in himself and others. For some good and valid reasons beyond mere human comprehension, the seabirds of the Gulf shun the Isabels. The rocky head of Azuera is their haunt, their stony levels and chasms resound with their wild and tumultuous clamour, as if they were forever quarrelling over the legendary treasure. At the end of his first day on the Great Isabel, Decoud, turning in his lair of coarse grass under the shade of a tree, said to himself, "I have not seen as much as one single bird all day." And he had not heard a sound either, all day, but that one now of his own muttering voice. It had been a day of absolute silence, the first he had known in his life, and he had not slept a wink, not for all these wakeful nights and the days of fighting, planning, talking. Not for all that last night of danger and hard physical toil upon the Gulf had he been able to close his eyes for a moment, and yet from sunrise to sunset he had been lying prone on the ground, either on his back or on his face. He stretched himself, and with slow steps descended into the gully to spend the night by the side of the Silver. If Nostromo returned, as he might have done at any moment, it was there that he would look first, and night would, of course, be the proper time for an attempt to communicate. He remembered with profound indifference that he had not eaten anything yet since he had been left alone on the island. He spent the night open-eyed, and when the day broke he ate something with the same indifference. The brilliant son Decoud, the spoiled darling of the family, the lover of Antonia and journalist of Sulaco, was not fit to grapple with himself single-handed. Solitude, from mere outward condition of existence, becomes very swiftly a state of soul in which the affectations of irony and scepticism have no place. It takes possession of the mind and drives forth the thought into the exile of utter unbelief. After 3 days of waiting for the sight of some human face, Decoud caught himself entertaining a doubt of his own individuality. It had merged into the world of cloud and water, of natural forces and forms of nature. In our activity alone do we find the sustaining illusion of an independent existence as against the whole scheme of things of which we form a helpless part. Decoud lost all belief in the reality of his action, past and to come. On the 5th day an immense melancholy descended upon him palpably. He resolved not to give himself up to these people in Sulaco who had beset him, unreal and terrible, like gibbering and obscene spectres. He saw himself struggling feebly in their midst, and Antonia, gigantic and lovely like an allegorical statue, looking on with scornful eyes at his weakness. Not a living being, not a speck of distant sail, appeared within the range of his vision, and as if to escape from this solitude he absorbed himself in his melancholy. The vague consciousness of a misdirected life, given up to impulses whose memory left a bitter taste in his mouth, was the first moral sentiment of his manhood. But at the same time he felt no remorse. What should he regret? He had recognized no other virtue than intelligence, and had directed passions into duties. Both his intelligence and his passions were swallowed up easily in this great unbroken solitude of waiting without faith. Sleeplessness had robbed his will of all energy, for he had not slept 7 hours in the 7 days. His sadness was the sadness of a sceptical mind. He beheld the universe as a succession of incomprehensible images. Nostromo was dead. Everything had failed ignominiously. He no longer dared to think of Antonia. She had not survived, but if she survived he could not face her, and all exertion seemed senseless. On the 10th day, after a night spent without even dozing off once, it had occurred to him that Antonia could not possibly have ever loved a being so impalpable as himself. The solitude appeared like a great void, and the silence of the gulf like a tense, thin cord to which he hung suspended by both hands, without fear, without surprise, without any sort of emotion whatever. Only toward the evening, in the comparative relief of coolness, he began to wish that this cord would snap. He imagined it snapping with a report as of a pistol, a sharp, full crack, and that would be the end of him. He contemplated that eventuality with pleasure, because he dreaded the sleepless nights in which the silence, remaining unbroken in the shape of a cord to which he hung with both hands, vibrated with senseless phrases, always the same but utterly incomprehensible, about Nostromo, Antonia, Barrios, and proclamations mingled into an ironical and senseless buzzing. In the daytime he could look at the silence like a still cord stretched to breaking point, with his life, his vain life, suspended to it like a weight. "I wonder whether I should hear it snap before I fell," he asked himself. The sun was 2 hours above the horizon when he got up, gaunt, dirty, white-faced, and looked at it with his red-rimmed eyes. His limbs obeyed him slowly, as if full of lead, yet without tremor, and the effect of that physical condition gave to his movements an unhesitating, deliberate dignity. He acted as if accomplishing some sort of rite. He descended into the gully, for the fascination of all that silver with its potential power survived alone outside of himself. He picked up the belt with the revolver that was lying there and buckled it round his waist. The cord of silence could never snap on the island. It must let him fall and sink into the sea, he thought. And sink! He was looking at the loose earth covering the treasure. In the sea. His aspect was that of a somnambulist. He lowered himself down on his knees slowly and went on grubbing with his fingers with industrious patience till he uncovered one of the boxes. Without a pause, as if doing some work done many times before, he slit it open and took 4 ingots, which he put in his pockets. He covered up the exposed box again and, step by step, came out of the gully. The bushes closed after him with a swish. It was on the third day of his solitude that he had dragged the dinghy near the water with an idea of rowing away somewhere, but had desisted partly at the whisper of lingering hope that Nostromo would return, partly from conviction of utter uselessness of all effort. Now she wanted only a slight shove to be set afloat. He had eaten a little every day after the first, and had some muscular strength left yet. Taking up the oars slowly, he pulled away from the cliff of the Great Isabel that stood behind him warm with sunshine, as if with the heat of life, bathed in a rich light from head to foot, as if in a radiance of hope and joy. He pulled straight towards the setting sun. When the gulf had grown dark, he ceased rowing and flung the sculls in. The hollow clatter they made in falling was the loudest noise he had ever heard in his life. It was a revelation. It seemed to recall him from far away. Actually, the thought, "Perhaps I may sleep tonight," passed through his mind. But he did not believe it. He believed in nothing, and he remained sitting on the thwart. The dawn from behind the mountains put a gleam into his unwinking eyes. After a clear daybreak, the sun appeared splendidly above the peaks of the range. The great gulf burst into a glitter all around the boat, and in this glory of merciless solitude the silence appeared again before him, stretching taut like a dark, thin string. His eyes looked at it while, without haste, he shifted his seat from the thwart to the gunwale. They looked at it fixedly while his hand, feeling about his waist, unbuttoned the flap of the leather case, drew the revolver, cocked it, brought it forward, pointing at his breast, pulled the trigger, and with convulsive force sent the still smoking weapon hurtling through the air. His eyes looked at it while he fell forward and hung with his breast on the gunwale and the fingers of his right hand hooked under the thwart. They looked. "It is done," he stammered out in a sudden flow of blood. His last thought was, "I wonder how that Capataz died." The stiffness of the fingers relaxed, and the lover of Antonia Avellanos rolled overboard without having heard the cord of silence snap in the solitude of the placid gulf, whose glittering surface remained untroubled by the fall of his body. A victim of the disillusioned weariness which is the retribution meted out to intellectual audacity, the brilliant Don Martin Decoud, weighted by the bars of San Tome Silva, disappeared without a trace, swallowed up in the immense indifference of things. His sleepless, crouching figure was gone from the side of the San Tome Silva, and for a time the spirits of good and evil that hover near every concealed treasure of the earth might have thought that this one had been forgotten by all mankind. Then, after a few days, another form appeared, striding away from the setting sun, to sit motionless and awake in the narrow black gully all through the night, in nearly the same pose, in the same place in which had sat that other sleepless man who had gone away forever so quietly in a small boat about the time of sunset. And the spirits of good and evil that hover about a forbidden treasure understood well that the silver of San Tome was provided now with a faithful and lifelong slave. The magnificent Capataz de Cargadores, victim of the disenchanted vanity which is the reward of audacious action, sat in the weary pose of a hunted outcast through a night of sleeplessness as tormenting as any known to Decoud, his companion in the most desperate affair of his life. And he wondered how Decoud had died. But he knew the part he had played himself, first a woman, then a man, abandoned both in their last extremity for the sake of this accursed treasure. It was paid for by a soul lost and by a vanished life. The blank stillness of awe was succeeded by a gust of immense pride. There was no one in the world but Gian Battista Fidanza, Capataz de Cargadores, the incorruptible and faithful Nostromo, to pay such a price. He had made up his mind that nothing should be allowed now to rob him of his bargain. Nothing. Decoud had died. But how? That he was dead he had not a shadow of a doubt. But 4 ingots? What for? Did he mean to come for more, some other time? The treasure was putting forth its latent power. It troubled the clear mind of the man who had paid the price. He was sure that Decoud was dead. The island seemed full of that whisper. Dead, gone. and he caught himself listening for the swish of bushes and the splash of the footfalls in the bed of the brook. Dead! The talker, the novio of Donna Antonia. Ah! He murmured, with his head on his knees, under the livid, clouded dawn breaking over the liberated Sulaco and upon the gulf as grey as ashes. It is to her that he will fly, to her that he will fly. And 4 ingots? Did he take them in revenge, to cast a spell, like the angry woman who had prophesied remorse and failure, and yet had laid upon him the task of saving the children? Well, he had saved the children. He had defeated the spell of poverty and starvation. He had done it all alone, or perhaps helped by the devil. Who cared? He had done it, betrayed as he was, and saving by the same stroke the San Tome mine, which appeared to him hateful and immense, lording it by its vast wealth over the valour, the toil, the fidelity of the poor, over war and peace, over the labours of the town, the sea, and the campo. The sun lit up the sky behind the peaks of the Cordillera. The Capites looked down for a time upon the fall of loose earth, stones, and smashed bushes, concealing the hiding place of the silver. I must grow rich very slowly, he meditated aloud. End of Part 3rd, The Lighthouse, Chapter 10. Part 3rd of Nostromo by Joseph Conrad, The Lighthouse, Chapter 11. This librivox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dann, Part 3rd, The Lighthouse, Chapter 11. Sulaco outstripped Nostromo's prudence, growing rich swiftly on the hidden treasures of the earth, hovered over by the anxious spirits of good and evil torn out by the labouring hands of the people. It was like a second youth, like a new life, full of promise, of unrest, of toil, scattering lavishly its wealth to the 4 corners of an excited world. Material changes swept along in the train of material interests, and other changes more subtle, outwardly unmarked, affected the minds and hearts of the workers. Captain Mitchell had gone home to live on his savings invested in the San Tome mine, and Dr. Monaghan had grown older, with his head steel grey, and the unchanged expression of his face, living on the inexhaustible treasure of his devotion, drawn upon in the secret of his heart, like a store of unlawful wealth. The Inspector-General of State Hospitals, whose maintenance is a charge upon the Gould Concession, official adviser on sanitation to the municipality, Chief Medical Officer of the San Tome Consolidated Mines, whose territory, containing gold, silver, copper, lead, cobalt, extends for miles along the foothills of the Cordillera, had felt poverty-stricken, miserable, and starved during the prolonged second visit the Goulds paid to Europe and the United States of America. Intimate of the Casa, proved friend, a bachelor without ties and without establishment, except of the professional sort, he had been asked to take up his quarters in the Gould house. In the 11 months of their absence, the familiar rooms, recalling at every glance the woman to whom he had given all his loyalty, had grown intolerable. As the day approached for the arrival of the mailboat Hermes, the latest addition to the OSN Company's splendid fleet, the doctor hobbled about more vivaciously, snapped more sardonically at simple and gentle, out of sheer nervousness. He packed up his modest trunk with speed, with fury, with enthusiasm, and saw it carried out past the old porter at the gate of the Casa Gould with delight, with intoxication. Then, as the hour approached, sitting alone in the great landau behind the white mules, a little sideways, his drawn-in face positively venomous with the effort of self-control, and holding a pair of new gloves in his left hand, he drove to the harbour. His heart dilated within him so when he saw the Goulds on the deck of the Hermes that his greetings were reduced to a casual mutter. Driving back to town, all 3 were silent, and in the patio the doctor, in a more natural manner, said, "I'll leave you now to yourselves. I'll call tomorrow, if I may." "Come to lunch, dear Dr. Monaghan, and come early," said Mrs. Gould, in her travelling dress and her veil down, turning to look at him at the foot of the stairs, while at the top of the flight the Madonna, in blue robes and the child on her arm, seemed to welcome her with an aspect of pitying tenderness. "Don't expect to find me at home," Charles Gould warned him. "I'll be off early to the mine." After lunch, Donna Amelia and the Senior Doctor came slowly through the inner gateway of the patio. The large gardens of the Casa Gould, surrounded by high walls, and the red-tile slopes of neighbouring roofs, lay open before them, with masses of shade under the trees and level surfaces of sunlight upon the lawns. A triple row of old orange trees surrounded the whole. Barefooted brown gardeners in snowy white shirts and wide calzoneras dotted the grounds, squatting over flower beds, passing between the trees, dragging slender india-rubber tubes across the gravel of the paths, and the fine jets of water crossed each other in graceful curves, sparkling in the sunshine with a slight pattering noise upon the bushes and an effect of showered diamonds upon the grass. Donna Amelia, holding up the train of a clear dress, walked by the side of Dr. Monaghan in a longish black coat and severe black bow on an immaculate shirt front. Under a shady clump of trees, where stood scattered little tables and wicker easy-chairs, Mrs. Gould sat down in a low and ample seat. "Don't go yet," she said to Dr. Monaghan, who was unable to tear himself away from the spot. His chin nestling within the points of his collar, he devoured her stealthily with his eyes, which, luckily, were round and hard like clouded marbles and incapable of disclosing his sentiments. His pitying emotion at the marks of time upon the face of that woman, the air of frailty and weary fatigue that had settled upon the eyes and temples of the never-tired Senora, as Don Pepe years ago used to call her with admiration, touched him almost to tears. "Don't go yet. Today is all my own," Mrs. Gould urged gently. "We're not back yet officially. No one will come. It's only tomorrow that the windows of the Casa Gould are to be lit up for a reception." The doctor dropped into a chair. "Giving a tertulia," he said with a detached air. "A simple greeting for all kind friends who care to come." "And only tomorrow?" "Yes, Charles would be tired out after a day at the mine, and so It would be good to have him to myself for one evening on our return to this house I love. It has seen all my life." "Ah, yes," snarled the doctor suddenly. "Women count time from the marriage feast. Didn't you live a little before?" "Yes, but what is there to remember? There were no cares." Mrs. Gould sighed. And as two friends, after a long separation, will revert to the most agitated periods of their lives, they began to talk of the Sulaco Revolution. It seemed strange to Mrs. Gould that people who had taken part in it seemed to forget its memory and its lesson. "And yet," struck in the doctor, "we who played our part in it had our reward. Don Pepe, though superannuated, can still sit a horse. Barrios is drinking himself to death in jovial company away somewhere on his fundacion beyond the Bolson de Tonoro. The heroic Father Roman, I imagine the old padre blowing up systematically the San Tome mine, uttering a pious exclamation at every bang and taking handfuls of snuff between the explosions. The heroic Padre Roman says he is not afraid of the harm Holroyd's missionaries can do to his flock as long as he is alive." Mrs. Gould shuddered a little at the allusion to the destruction that had come so near to the San Tome mine. "Ah, but you, dear friend?" "I did the work I was fit for." "You faced the most cruel dangers of all, something more than death." "No, Mrs. Gould, only death, by hanging, and I am rewarded beyond my deserts." Noticing Mrs. Gould's gaze fixed upon him, he dropped his eyes. "I made my career, as you see," said the Inspector General of State Hospitals, taking up lightly the lapels of his superfine black coat. The doctor's self-respect, marked inwardly by the almost complete disappearance from his dreams of Father Baron, appeared visibly in what, by contrast with former carelessness, seemed an immoderate cult of personal appearance. Carried out within severe limits of form and colour, and in perpetual freshness, this change of apparel gave to Dr. Monaghan an air at the same time professional and festive, while his gait and the unchanged crabbed character of his face acquired from it a startling force of incongruity. "Yes," he went on, "we all had our rewards. The engineer-in-chief, Captain Mitchell—" "We saw him," interrupted Mrs. Gould in her charming voice. The poor dear man came up from the country on purpose to call on us in our hotel in London. He comported himself with great dignity, but I fancy he regrets Sulaco. He rambled feebly about historical events till I felt I could have a cry. Grunted the doctor. Getting old, I suppose. Even Nostromo is getting older, though he has not changed. And speaking of that fellow, I wanted to tell you something. For some time the house had been full of murmurs, of agitation. Suddenly the two gardeners, busy with rose trees at the side of the garden arch, fell upon their knees with bowed heads on the passage of Antonia Avellanos, who appeared walking beside her uncle. Invested with a red hat after a short visit to Rome, where he had been invited by the propaganda, Father Corbelan, missionary to the wild Indians, conspirator, friend, and patron of Hernandez the robber, advanced with big, slow strides, gaunt and leaning forward, with his powerful hands clasped behind his back. The first Cardinal Archbishop of Sulaco had preserved his fanatical and morose air, the aspect of a chaplain of bandits. It was believed that his unexpected elevation to the purple was a counter-move to the Protestant invasion of Sulaco organised by the Holroyd Missionary Fund. Antonia, the beauty of her face as if a little blurred, her figure slightly fuller, advanced with her light walk and her high serenity, smiling from a distance at Mrs. Gould. She had brought her uncle over to see dear Amarilla, without ceremony, just for a moment, before the siesta. When all was seated again, Dr. Monaghan, who had come to dislike heartily everybody who approached Mrs. Gould with any intimacy, kept aside, pretending to be lost in profound meditation. A louder phrase of Antonia made him lift his head. "How can we abandon, groaning under oppression, those who have been our countrymen only a few years ago, who are our countrymen now?" Miss Avellanos was saying. "How can we remain blind and deaf without pity to the cruel wrong suffered by our brothers? There is a remedy." "Annex the rest of Costaguana to the order and prosperity of Sulaco," snapped the doctor. "There is no other remedy." "I am convinced, Senor Doctor," Antonia said with the earnest calm of invincible resolution, "that this was from the first poor Martin's intention." "Yes, but the material interests will not let you jeopardize their development for a mere idea of pity and justice," the doctor muttered grumpily. "And it is just as well, perhaps." The Cardinal Archbishop straightened up his gaunt, bony frame. "We have worked for them, we have made them, these material interests of the foreigners," the last of the Corbelans uttered in a deep denunciatory tone. "And without them you are nothing," cried the doctor from the distance. "They will not let you." "Let them beware then, lest the people, prevented from their aspirations, should rise and claim their share of the wealth and their share of the power," the popular Cardinal Archbishop of Sulaco declared, significantly, menacingly. A silence ensued, during which His Eminence stared, frowning at the ground, and Antonia, graceful and rigid in her chair, breathed calmly in the strength of her convictions. Then the conversation took a social turn, touching on the visit of the Goulds to Europe. The Cardinal Archbishop, when in Rome, had suffered from neuralgia in the head all the time. It was the climate, the bad air. When uncle and niece had gone away, with the servants again falling on their knees, and the old porter, who had known Henry Gould, almost totally blind and impotent now, creeping up to kiss His Eminence's extended hand, Dr. Monaghan, looking after them, pronounced the one word, "Incorrigible." Mrs. Gould, with a look upwards, dropped wearily on her lap, her white hands flashing with the gold and stones of many rings. "Conspiring, yes," said the doctor. "The last of the Avellanos and the last of the Corbelans are conspiring with the refugees from Santa Marta that flock here after every revolution. The Café Lambrusco at the corner of the Plaza is full of them. You can hear their chatter across the street like the noise of a parrot house. They're conspiring for the invasion of Costaguana. And do you know where they go for strength, for the necessary force? To the secret societies amongst immigrants and natives, where Nostromo, I should say Captain Verdanza, is the great man. What gives him that position? Who can say? Genius? He has genius. He is greater with the populace than ever he was before. It is as if he had some secret power, some mysterious means to keep up his influence. He holds conferences with the Archbishop, as in those old days which you and I remember. Barrios is useless, but for a military head they have the pious Hernandez, and they may raise the country with the new cry of the wealth for the people. Will there never be any peace? Will there be no rest? Mrs. Gould whispered. I thought that we... No, interrupted the doctor. There is no peace and no rest in the development of material interests. They have their law and their justice, but it is founded on expediency and is inhuman. It is without rectitude, without the continuity and the force that can be found only in a moral principle. Mrs. Gould, the time approaches when all that the Gould concession stands for shall weigh as heavily upon the people as the barbarism, cruelty and misrule of a few years back. How can you say that, Dr. Monningham? She cried out, as if hurt in the most sensitive place of her soul. I can say what is true, the doctor insisted obstinately. It'll weigh as heavily and provoke resentment, bloodshed and vengeance, because the men have grown different. Do you think that now the mine would march upon the town to save their Senor Administrador? Do you think that? She pressed the backs of her entwined hands on her eyes and murmured hopelessly, Is it this we have worked for, then? The doctor lowered his head. He could follow her silent thought. Was it for this that her life had been robbed of all the intimate felicities of daily affection which her tenderness needed, as the human body needs air to breathe? And the doctor, indignant with Charles Gould's blindness, hastened to change the conversation. It is about Nostromo that I wanted to talk to you. Ah, that fellow has some continuity and force. Nothing will put an end to him. But never mind that. There's something inexplicable going on, or perhaps only too easy to explain. You know, Linda is practically the lighthouse keeper of the great Isabel light. The garibaldino is too old now. His part is to clean the lamps and to cook in the house, but he can't get up the stairs any longer. The black-eyed Linda sleeps all day and watches the light all night. Not all day, though. She is up towards 5 in the afternoon when our Nostromo, whenever he is in harbour with his schooner, comes out on his courting visit, pulling in a small boat. Aren't they married yet? Mrs. Gould asked. The mother wished it, as far as I can understand, while Linda was yet quite a child. When I had the girls with me for a year or so during the War of Separation, that extraordinary Linda used to declare quite simply that she was going to be Gian Battista's wife. They are not married yet, said the doctor curtly. I have looked after them a little. Thank you, dear Dr. Monningham, said Mrs. Gould, and under the shade of the big trees her little even teeth gleamed in a youthful smile of gentle malice. People don't know how really good you are. You will not let them know, as if on purpose to annoy me, who have put my faith in your good heart long ago. The doctor, with a lifting up of his upper lip as though he were longing to bite, bowed stiffly in his chair. With the utter absorption of a man to whom love comes late, not as the most splendid of illusions, but like an enlightening and priceless misfortune, the sight of that woman of whom he had been deprived for nearly a year suggested ideas of adoration, of kissing the hem of her robe, and this excess of feeling translated itself naturally into an augmented grimness of speech. I am afraid of being overwhelmed by too much gratitude. However, these people interest me. I went out several times to the great Isabel light to look after old Giorgio. He did not tell Mrs. Gould that it was because he found there, in her absence, the relief of an atmosphere of congenial sentiment in old Giorgio's austere admiration for the English Signora, the benefactress, in black-eyed Linda's voluble, torrential, passionate affection for our Donna Amarilla, that angel, in the white-throated fair Giselle's adoring upward turn of the eyes, which then glided towards him with a sidelong, half-arch, half-candid glance, which made the doctor exclaim to himself mentally, "If I weren't what I am, old and ugly, I would think the minx is making eyes at me. And perhaps she is. I dare say she would make eyes at anybody." Dr. Monningham said nothing of this to Mrs. Gould, the providence of the Viola family, but reverted to what he called our great Nostromo. "What I wanted to tell you is this. Our great Nostromo did not take much notice of the old man and the children for some years. It's true, too, that he was away on his coasting voyages, certainly 10 months out of the 12. He was making his fortune, as he told Captain Mitchell once. He seems to have done uncommonly well. It was only to be expected. He is a man full of resource, full of confidence in himself, ready to take chances and risks of every sort. I remember being in Mitchell's office one day when he came in with that calm, grave air he always carries everywhere. He had been away trading in the Gulf of California, he said, looking straight past us at the wall, as his manner is, and was glad to see on his return that a lighthouse was being built on the cliff of the Great Isabel. Very glad, he repeated. Mitchell explained that it was the OSN company who was building it for the convenience of the mail service on his own advice. Captain Fidanza was good enough to say that it was excellent advice. I remember him twisting up his moustaches and looking all round the cornice of the room before he proposed that old Giorgio should be made the keeper of that light. I had heard of this. I was consulted at the time, Mrs. Gould said. I doubted whether it would be good for these girls to be shut up on that island as if in a prison. The proposal fell in with the old Garibaldino's humour. As to Linda, any place was lovely and delightful enough for her as long as it was Nostromo's suggestion. She could wait for her Gianbattista's good pleasure there as well as anywhere else. My opinion is that she was always in love with that incorruptible Capataz. Moreover, both father and sister were anxious to get Giselle away from the attention of a certain Ramirez. "Ah," said Mrs. Gould, interested. "Ramirez. What sort of man is that?" "Just a mozo of the town. His father was a cargador. As a lanky boy he ran about the wharf in rags, till Nostromo took him up and made a man of him. When he got a little older they put him into a lighter, and very soon gave him charge of the No. 3 boat, the boat which took the silver away, Mrs. Gould. Nostromo selected that lighter for the works because she was the best sailing and the strongest boat of all the company's fleet. Young Ramirez was one of the 5 cargadores entrusted with the removal of the treasure from the custom house on that famous night. As the boat he had charge of was sunk, Nostromo, on leaving the company's service, recommended him to Captain Mitchell for his successor. He had trained him in the routine of work perfectly, and thus Mr. Ramirez, from a starving waif, becomes a man and the capataz of the Sulaco Cargadores. "Thanks to Nostromo," said Mrs. Gould with warm approval. "Thanks to Nostromo," repeated Dr. Monningham. "Upon my word, the fellow's power frightens me when I think of it. That our poor old Mitchell was only too glad to appoint somebody trained to the work who saved him trouble is not surprising. What is wonderful is the fact that the Sulaco Cargadores accepted Ramirez for their chief simply because such was Nostromo's good pleasure. Of course, he is not a second Nostromo, as he fondly imagined he would be, but still, the position was brilliant enough. It emboldened him to make up to Giselle Viola, who, you know, is the recognized beauty of the town. The old Garibaldino, however, took a violent dislike to him. I don't know why. Perhaps because he was not a model of perfection, like his Gianbattista, the incarnation of the courage, the fidelity, the honour of the people. Signor Viola does not think much of Sulaco natives. Both of them, the old Spartan and that white-faced Linda with her red mouth and coal-black eyes, were looking rather fiercely after the fair one. Ramirez was warned off. Father Viola, I am told, threatened him with his gun once. "But what of Giselle herself?" asked Mrs. Gould. "She's a bit of a flirt, I believe," said the doctor. "I don't think she cared much one way or another. Of course she likes men's attentions. Ramirez was not the only one, let me tell you, Mrs. Gould. There was one engineer, at least, on the railway staff who got warned off with a gun too. Old Viola does not allow any trifling with his honour. He has grown uneasy and suspicious since his wife died. He was very pleased to remove his youngest girl away from the town. But look what happens, Mrs. Gould. Ramirez, the honest, love-lorn swain, is forbidden the island. Very well, he respects the prohibition, but naturally turns his eyes frequently towards the great Isabel. It seems as though he had been in the habit of gazing late at night upon the light. And during these sentimental vigils, he discovers that Nostromo, Captain Verdanza that is, returns very late from his visits to the Violas, as late as midnight at times. The doctor paused and stared meaningly at Mrs. Gould. "Yes, but I don't understand," she began, looking puzzled. "Now comes the strange part," went on Dr. Monningham. "Viola, who is king on his island, will allow no visitors on it after dark. Even Captain Verdanza has got to leave after sunset, when Linda has gone up to tend the light. And Nostromo goes away obediently. But what happens afterwards? What does he do in the gulf between 6:30 and midnight? He has been seen more than once at that late hour pulling quietly into the harbour. Ramirez is devoured by jealousy. He dared not approach old Viola, but he plucked up courage to rail at Linda about it on Sunday morning as she came on the mainland to hear Mass and visit her mother's grave. There was a scene on the wharf which, as a matter of fact, I witnessed. It was early morning. He must have been waiting for her on purpose. I was there by the merest chance, having been called to an urgent consultation by the doctor of the German gunboat in the harbour. She poured wrath, scorn, and flame upon Ramirez, who seemed out of his mind. It was a strange sight, Mrs. Gould. The long jetty with this raving cargadore in his crimson sash, and the girl all in black at the end, the early Sunday morning quiet of the harbour in the shade of the mountains. Nothing but a canoe or two moving between the ships at anchor, and the German gunboat's gig coming to take me off. Linda passed me within a foot. I noticed her wild eyes. I called out to her. She never heard me. She never saw me. But I looked at her face. It was awful in its anger and wretchedness. Mrs. Gould sat up, opening her eyes very wide. "What do you mean, Dr. Monningham? Do you mean to say that you suspect the younger sister?" "Quien sabe? Who can tell?" said the doctor, shrugging his shoulders like a born Costaguanero. "Ramirez came up to me on the wharf. He reeled. He looked insane. He took his head into his hands. He had to talk to someone, simply had to. Of course, for all his mad state, he recognized me. People know me well here. I have lived too long amongst them to be anything else but the evil-eyed doctor who can cure all the ills of the flesh and bring bad luck by a glance. He came up to me. He tried to be calm. He tried to make out that he wanted merely to warn me against Nostromo. It seems that Captain Verdanza, at some secret meeting or other, had mentioned me as the worst despiser of all the poor, of the people. It's very possible he honours me with his undying dislike. And a word from the great Verdanza may be quite enough to send some fool's knife into my back. The sanitary commission I preside over is not in favour with the populace. Beware of him, Senor Doctor. Destroy him, Senor Doctor, Ramirez hissed right into my face. And then he broke out. That man, he spluttered, has cast a spell upon both these girls. As to himself, he had said too much. He must run away now, run away and hide somewhere. He moaned tenderly about Giselle and then called her names that cannot be repeated. If he thought she could be made to love him by any means, he would carry her off the island, off into the woods, but it was no good. He strode away, flourishing his arms above his head. Then I noticed an old negro who had been sitting behind a pile of cases, fishing from the wharf. He wound up his lines and slunk away at once, but he must have heard something, and must have talked too, because some of the old Garibaldino's railway friends, I suppose, warned him against Ramirez. At any rate, the father has been warned, but Ramirez has disappeared from the town. "I feel I have a duty towards these girls," said Mrs. Gould uneasily. "Is Nostromo in Sulaco now?" "He is, since last Sunday." "He ought to be spoken to at once." "Who will dare speak to him? Even the love-mad Ramirez runs away from the mere shadow of Captain Verdanza." "I can. I will," Mrs. Gould declared. "A word will be enough for a man like Nostromo." The doctor smiled sourly. "He must end this situation, which lends itself to—" "I can't believe it of that child," pursued Mrs. Gould. "He's very attractive," muttered the doctor gloomily. "He'll see it, I'm sure. He must put an end to all this by marrying Linda at once," pronounced the First Lady of Sulaco with immense decision. Through the garden gate emerged Basilio, grown flat and sleek, with an elderly, hairless face, wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, and his jet-black coarse hair plastered down smoothly. Stooping carefully behind an ornamental clump of bushes, he put down with precaution a small child he had been carrying on his shoulder, his own and Leonarda's last-born. The pouting, spoiled camarista and the head mozo of the Casa Gould had been married for some years now. He remained squatting on his heels for a time, gazing fondly at his offspring, which returned his stare with imperturbable gravity, then, solemn and respectable, walked down the path. "What is it, Basilio?" asked Mrs. Gould. "A telephone came through from the office of the mine. The master remains to sleep at the mountain tonight." Dr. Monningham had got up and stood looking away. A profound silence reigned for a time under the shade of the biggest trees in the lovely gardens of the Casa Gould. "Very well, Basilio," said Mrs. Gould. She watched him walk away along the path, step aside behind the flowering bush, and reappear with the child seated on his shoulder. He passed through the gateway between the garden and the patio with measured steps, careful of his light burden. The doctor, with his back to Mrs. Gould, contemplated a flower bed away in the sunshine. People believed him scornful and soured. The truth of his nature consisted in his capacity for passion and in the sensitiveness of his temperament. What he lacked was the polished callousness of men of the world, the callousness from which springs an easy tolerance for oneself and others, the tolerance wide as poles asunder from true sympathy and human compassion. This want of callousness accounted for his sardonic turn of mind and his biting speeches. In profound silence and glaring viciously at the brilliant flower-bed, Dr. Monningham poured mental imprecations on Charles Gould's head. Behind him, the immobility of Mrs. Gould added to the grace of her seated figure the charm of art, of an attitude caught and interpreted forever. Turning abruptly, the doctor took his leave. Mrs. Gould leaned back in the shade of the big trees planted in a circle. She leaned back with her eyes closed and her white hands lying idle on the arms of her seat. The half-light under the thick mass of leaves brought out the youthful prettiness of her face, made the clear light fabrics and white lace of her dress appear luminous. Small and dainty, as if radiating a light of her own in the deep shade of the interlaced boughs, she resembled a good fairy, weary with a long career of well-doing, touched by the withering suspicion of the uselessness of her labours, the powerlessness of her magic. Had anybody asked her of what she was thinking, alone in the garden of the Casa, with her husband at the mine, and the house closed to the street like an empty dwelling, her frankness would have had to evade the question. It had come into her mind that for life to be large and full, it must contain the care of the past and of the future in every passing moment of the present. Our daily work must be done to the glory of the dead and for the good of those who come after. She thought that, and sighed without opening her eyes, without moving at all. Mrs. Gould's face became set and rigid for a second, as if to receive, without flinching, a great wave of loneliness that swept over her head. And it came into her mind, too, that no one would ever ask her with solicitude what she was thinking of. No one. No one but perhaps the man who had just gone away. No one who could be answered with careless sincerity in the ideal perfection of confidence. The word incorrigible, a word lately pronounced by Dr. Monningham, floated into her still and sad immobility. incorrigible in his hard, determined service of the material interests to which he had pinned his faith in the triumph of order and justice. Poor boy! She had a clear vision of the grey hairs on his temples. He was perfect, perfect. What more could she have expected? It was a colossal and lasting success, and love was only a short moment of forgetfulness, a short intoxication whose delight one remembered with a sense of sadness, as if it had been a deep grief lived through. There was something inherent in the necessities of successful action which carried with it the moral degradation of the idea. She saw the San Tome mountain hanging over the Campo, over the whole land, feared, hated, wealthy, more soulless than any tyrant, more pitiless and autocratic than the worst government, ready to crush innumerable lives in the expansion of its greatness. He did not see it. He could not see it. It was not his fault. He was perfect, perfect, but she would never have him to herself. Never. Not for one short hour together to herself in this old Spanish house she loved so well. Incorrigible, the last of the Corbalans, the last of the Avellanos, the doctor had said. But she saw clearly the San Tome mine possessing, consuming, burning up the life of the last of the Costaguana Goulds, mastering the energetic spirit of the son as it had mastered the lamentable weakness of the father. A terrible success for the last of the Goulds, the last. She had hoped for a long, long time that perhaps... But no, there were to be no more. An immense desolation, the dread of her own continued life, descended upon the First Lady of Sulaco. With a prophetic vision she saw herself surviving alone the degradation of her young ideal of life, of love, of work, all alone in the treasure house of the world. The profound, blind, suffering expression of a painful dream settled on her face with its closed eyes. In the indistinct voice of an unlucky sleeper lying passive in the grip of a merciless nightmare, she stammered out aimlessly the words, material interest. End of Part 3rd, The Lighthouse, Chapter 11. Part 3rd of Nostromo by Joseph Conrad, The Lighthouse, Chapter 12. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dann. Part 3rd, The Lighthouse, Chapter 12. Nostromo had been growing rich very slowly. It was an effect of his prudence. He could command himself even when thrown off his balance. And to become the slave of a treasure with full self-knowledge is an occurrence rare and mentally disturbing. But it was also in a great part because of the difficulty of converting it into a form in which it could become available. The mere act of getting it away from the island piecemeal, little by little, was surrounded by difficulties, by the dangers of imminent detection. He had to visit the Great Isabel in secret, between his voyages along the coast, which were the ostensible source of his fortune. The crew of his own schooner were to be feared as if they had been spies upon their dreaded captain. He did not dare stay too long in port. When his coaster was unloaded, he hurried away on another trip, for he feared arousing suspicion even by a day's delay. Sometimes, during a week's stay or more, he could only manage one visit to the treasure, and that was all, a couple of ingots. He suffered through his fears as much as through his prudence. To do things by stealth humiliated him, and he suffered most from the concentration of his thought upon the treasure. A transgression, a crime entering a man's existence, eats it up like a malignant growth, consumes it like a fever. Nostromo had lost his peace. The genuineness of all his qualities was destroyed. He felt it himself, and often cursed the silver of San Tome. His courage, his magnificence, his leisure, his work, everything was as before, only everything was a sham. But the treasure was real. He clung to it with a more tenacious mental grip, but he hated the feel of the ingots. Sometimes, after putting away a couple of them in his cabin, the fruit of a secret night expedition to the Great Isabel, he would look fixedly at his fingers as if surprised they had left no stain on his skin. He had found means of disposing of the silver bars in distant ports. The necessity to go far afield made his coasting voyages long and caused his visits to the Viola household to be rare and far between. He was fated to have his wife from there. He had said so once to Giorgio himself, but the Garibaldino had put the subject aside with a majestic wave of his hand, clutching the smouldering black briar-root pipe. There was plenty of time. He was not the man to force his girls upon anybody. As time went on, Nostromo discovered his preference for the younger of the two. They had some profound similarities of nature, which must exist for complete confidence and understanding, no matter what outward differences of temperament there may be to exercise their own fascination of contrast. His wife would have to know his secret, or else life would be impossible. He was attracted by Giselle, with her candid gaze and white throat, pliable, silent, fond of excitement under her quiet indolence, whereas Linda, with her intense, passionately pale face, energetic, all fire and words, touched with gloom and scorn, a chip of the old block, true daughter of the austere republican, but with Teresa's voice, inspired him with a deep-seated mistrust. Moreover, the poor girl could not conceal her love for Gian Battista. He could see it would be violent, exacting, suspicious, uncompromising, like her soul. Giselle, by her fair but warm beauty, by the surface placidity of her nature holding a promise of submissiveness, by the charm of her girlish mysteriousness, excited his passion and allayed his fears as to the future. His absences from Sulaco were long. On returning from the longest of them, he made out lighters loaded with blocks of stone lying under the cliff of the Great Isabel, cranes and scaffolding above, workmen's figures moving about, and a small lighthouse already rising from its foundations on the edge of the cliff. At this unexpected, undreamt of, startling sight, he thought himself lost irretrievably. What could save him from detection now? Nothing. He was struck with amazed dread at this turn of chance that would kindle a far-reaching light upon the only secret spot of his life, that life whose very essence, value, reality consisted in its reflection from the admiring eyes of men. All of it but that thing which was beyond common comprehension, which stood between him and the power that hears and gives effect to the evil intention of curses. It was dark. Not every man had such a darkness. And they were going to put a light there, a light. He saw it shining upon disgrace, poverty, contempt. Somebody was sure to, perhaps somebody had already. The incomparable Nostromo, the Capataz, the respected and feared Captain Fidanza, the unquestioned patron of secret societies, a republican like old Giorgio and a revolutionist at heart, but in another manner, was on the point of jumping overboard from the deck of his own schooner. That man, subjective almost to insanity, looked suicide deliberately in the face. But he never lost his head. He was checked by the thought that this was no escape. He imagined himself dead, and the disgrace, the shame, going on. Or rather, properly speaking, he could not imagine himself dead. He was possessed too strongly by the sense of his own existence, a thing of infinite duration in its changes, to grasp the notion of finality. The earth goes on forever. And he was courageous. It was a corrupt courage, but it was as good for his purposes as the other kind. He sailed close to the cliff of the Great Isabel, throwing a penetrating glance from the deck at the mouth of the ravine, tangled in an undisturbed growth of bushes. He sailed close enough to exchange hails with the workmen, shading their eyes on the edge of the sheer drop of the cliff, overhung by the jib-head of a powerful crane. He perceived that none of them had any occasion even to approach the ravine where the silver lay hidden, let alone to enter it. In the harbour he learned that no one slept on the island. The labouring gangs returned to port every evening, singing chorus songs in the empty lighters towed by a harbour tug. For the moment he had nothing to fear. But afterwards, he asked himself. Later, when a keeper came to live in the cottage that was being built some 150 yards back from the low light tower and 400 or so from the dark, shaded, jungly ravine containing the secret of his safety, of his influence, of his magnificence, of his power over the future, of his defiance of ill luck, of every possible betrayal from rich and poor alike. What then? He could never shake off the treasure. His audacity, greater than that of other men, had welded that vein of silver into his life. And the feeling of fearful and ardent subjection, the feeling of his slavery, so irremediable and profound that often in his thoughts he compared himself to the legendary gringos, neither dead nor alive, bound down to their conquest of unlawful wealth on Azuera, weighed heavily on the independent Captain Fidanza, owner and master of a coasting schooner, whose smart appearance and fabulous good luck in trading was so well known along the western seaboard of a vast continent. Fiercely whiskered and grave, a shade less supple in his walk, the vigour and symmetry of his powerful limbs lost in the vulgarity of a brown tweed suit made by Jews in the slums of London and sold by the clothing department of the Compagnia Anzani, Captain Fidanza was seen in the streets of Sulaco attending to his business, as usual, that trip. And, as usual, he allowed it to get about that he had made a great profit on his cargo. It was a cargo of salt fish, and Lent was approaching. He was seen in tramcars going to and fro between the town and the harbour. He talked with people in a cafe or two in his measured, steady voice. Captain Fidanza was seen. The generation that would know nothing of the famous ride to Caïta was not born yet. Nostromo, the miscalled Capataz de Cargadores, had made for himself, under his rightful name, another public existence, but modified by the new conditions, less picturesque, more difficult to keep up in the increased size and varied population of Sulaco, the progressive capital of the Occidental Republic. Captain Fidanza, unpicturesque but always a little mysterious, was recognised quite sufficiently under the lofty glass and iron roof of the Sulaco railway station. He took a local train and got out in Rinson, where he visited the widow of the cargador who had died of his wounds at the dawn of the new era, like Don José Avellanos, in the patio of the Casa Gould. He consented to sit down and drink a glass of cool lemonade in the hut, while the woman, standing up, poured a perfect torrent of words to which he did not listen. He left some money with her, as usual. The orphaned children, growing up and well-schooled, calling him uncle, clamoured for his blessing. He gave that too, and in the doorway paused for a moment to look at the flat face of the San Tome mountain with a faint frown. This slight contraction of his bronzed brow, casting a marked tinge of severity upon his usual unbending expression, was observed at the lodge which he attended, but went away before the banquet. He wore it at the meeting of some good comrades, Italians and Occidentals, assembled in his honour under the presidency of an indigent, sickly, somewhat hunchbacked little photographer with a white face and a magnanimous soul dyed crimson by a bloodthirsty hate of all capitalists, oppressors of the two hemispheres. The heroic Giorgio Viola, old revolutionist, would have understood nothing of his opening speech, and Captain Fidanza, lavishly generous as usual to some poor comrades, made no speech at all. He had listened, frowning, with his mind far away, and walked off unapproachable, silent, like a man full of cares. His frown deepened as, in the early morning, he watched the stonemasons go off to the Great Isabel in lighters loaded with squared blocks of stone, enough to add another course to the squat light tower. That was the rate of the work, 1 course per day. And Captain Fidanza meditated. The presence of strangers on the island would cut him completely off the treasure. It had been difficult and dangerous enough before. He was afraid, and he was angry. He thought with the resolution of a master and the cunning of a cowed slave. Then he went ashore. He was a man of resource and ingenuity, and, as usual, the expedient he found at a critical moment was effective enough to alter the situation radically. He had the gift of evolving safety out of the very danger, this incomparable Nostromo, this fellow in 1,000. With Giorgio established on the Great Isabel, there would be no need for concealment. He would be able to go openly, in daylight, to see his daughters, one of his daughters, and stay late talking to the old garibaldino. Then, in the dark, night after night, he would dare to grow rich quicker now. He yearned to clasp, embrace, absorb, subjugate in unquestioned possession this treasure whose tyranny had weighed upon his mind, his actions, his very sleep. He went to see his friend Captain Mitchell, and the thing was done as Dr. Monaghan had related to Mrs. Gould. When the project was mooted to the garibaldino, something like the faint reflection, the dim ghost of a very ancient smile, stole under the white and enormous moustaches of the old hater of kings and ministers. His daughters were the object of his anxious care. The younger especially. Linda, with her mother's voice, had taken more her mother's place. Her deep, vibrating padre seemed, but for the change of the word, the very echo of the impassioned, remonstrating Giorgio of poor Signora Teresa. It was his fixed opinion that the town was no proper place for his girls. The infatuated but guileless Ramirez was the object of his profound aversion, as resuming the sins of the country whose people were blind, vile esclavos. On his return from his next voyage, Captain Fidanza found the Violas settled in the lightkeeper's cottage. His knowledge of Giorgio's idiosyncrasies had not played him false. The garibaldino had refused to entertain the idea of any companion whatever except his girls, and Captain Mitchell, anxious to please his poor Nostromo with that felicity of inspiration which only true affection can give, had formally appointed Linda Viola as underkeeper of the Isabel's light. "The light is private property," he used to explain. "It belongs to my company. I've the power to nominate whom I like, and Viola it shall be. It's about the only thing Nostromo, a man worth his weight in gold, mind you, has ever asked me to do for him." Directly his schooner was anchored opposite the new custom house, with its sham air of a Greek temple, flat-roofed with a colonnade, Captain Fidanza went pulling his small boat out of the harbour, bound for the Great Isabel, openly, in the light of a declining day, before all men's eyes, with a sense of having mastered the fates. He must establish a regular position. He would ask him for his daughter now. He thought of Giselle as he pulled. Linda loved him, perhaps, but the old man would be glad to keep the elder, who had his wife's voice. He did not pull for the narrow strand where he had landed with Decoud, and afterwards alone on his first visit to the treasure. He made for the beach at the other end, and walked up the regular and gentle slope of the wedge-shaped island. Giorgio Viola, whom he saw from afar, sitting on a bench under the front wall of the cottage, lifted his arm slightly to his loud hail. He walked up. Neither of the girls appeared. "It is good here," said the old man in his austere, far-away manner. Nostromo nodded, and then, after a short silence, "You saw my schooner pass in not 2 hours ago? Do you know why I'm here before, so to speak, my anchor has fairly bitten into the ground of this port of Sulaco?" "You are welcome like a son," the old man declared quietly, staring away upon the sea. "Ah, thy son. I know. I am what thy son would have been. It is well, viejo. It is a very good welcome. Listen, I have come to ask you for—" A sudden dread came upon the fearless and incorruptible Nostromo. He dared not utter the name in his mind. The slight pause only imparted a marked weight and solemnity to the changed end of the phrase. "For my wife." His heart was beating fast. "It is time you—" The garibaldino arrested him with an extended arm. "That was left for you to judge." He got up slowly. His beard, unclipped since Teresa's death, thick, snow-white, covered his powerful chest. He turned his head to the door and called out in his strong voice, "Linda!" Her answer came sharp and faint from within, and the appalled Nostromo stood up too, but remained mute, gazing at the door. He was afraid. He was not afraid of being refused the girl he loved. No mere refusal could stand between him and a woman he desired, but the shining spectre of the treasure rose before him, claiming his allegiance in a silence that could not be gainsaid. He was afraid because, neither dead nor alive, like the gringos on Azuera, he belonged body and soul to the unlawfulness of his audacity. He was afraid of being forbidden the island. He was afraid, and said nothing. Seeing the two men standing side by side to await her, Linda stopped in the doorway. Nothing could alter the passionate, dead whiteness of her face, but her black eyes seemed to catch and concentrate all the light of the low sun in a flaming spark within the black depths, covered at once by the slow descent of heavy eyelids. "Behold thy husband, master, and benefactor." Old Viola's voice resounded with a force that seemed to fill the whole gulf. She stepped forward with her eyes nearly closed, like a sleepwalker in a beatific dream. Nostromo made a superhuman effort. "It is time, Linda, we two were betrothed," he said steadily in his level, careless, unbending tone. She put her hand into his offered palm, lowering her head, dark with bronze glints, upon which her father's hand rested for a moment. "And so the soul of the dead is satisfied." This came from Giorgio Viola, who went on talking for a while of his dead wife, while the two, sitting side by side, never looked at each other. Then the old man ceased, and Linda, motionless, began to speak. "Ever since I have lived in the world, I have lived for you alone, Gian Battista, and that you knew it, Battistino." She pronounced the name exactly with her mother's intonation. A gloom as of the grave covered Nostromo's heart. "Yes, I knew," he said. The heroic Garibaldino sat on the same bench, bowing his hoary head, his old soul dwelling alone with its memories, tender and violent, terrible and dreary, solitary on the earth full of men. And Linda, his best beloved daughter, was saying, "I was yours ever since I can remember. I had only to think of you for the earth to become empty to my eyes. When you were there, I could see no one else. I was yours. Nothing is changed. The world belongs to you, and you let me live in it." She dropped her low, vibrating voice to a still lower note, and found other things to say, torturing for the man at her side. Her murmur ran on, ardent and voluble. She did not seem to see her sister, who came out with an altar cloth she was embroidering in her hands, and passed in front of them, silent, fresh, fair, with a quick glance and a faint smile, to sit a little away on the other side of Nostromo. The evening was still. The sun sank almost to the edge of a purple ocean, and the white lighthouse, livid against the background of clouds filling the head of the gulf, bore the lantern red and glowing like a live ember kindled by the fire of the sky. Giselle, indolent and demure, raised the altar cloth from time to hide nervous yawns as of a young panther. Suddenly Linda rushed at her sister, and seizing her hand, covered her face with kisses. Nostromo's brain reeled. When she left her, as if stunned by the violent caresses, with her hands lying in her lap, the slave of the treasure felt as if he could shoot that woman. Old Giorgio lifted his leonine head. "Where are you going, Linda?" "To the light, padre mio." "Si, to your duty." He got up too, looked after his eldest daughter, then, in a tone whose festive note seemed the echo of a mood lost in the night of ages, "I am going to cook something. Ah, son! The old man knows where to find a bottle of wine, too." He turned to Giselle with a change to austere tenderness. "And you, little one, Pray not to the God of priests and slaves, but to the God of orphans, of the oppressed, of the poor, of little children, to give thee a man like this one for a husband." His hand rested heavily for a moment on Nostromo's shoulder, and then he went in. The hopeless slave of the San Tome silver felt at these words the venomous fangs of jealousy biting deep into his heart. He was appalled by the novelty of the experience, by its force, by its physical intimacy. A husband for her. And yet it was natural that Giselle should have a husband at some time or other. He had never realized that before. In discovering that her beauty could belong to another, he felt as though he could kill this one of old Giorgio's daughters also. He muttered moodily, "They say you love Ramirez." She shook her head without looking at him. Coppery glints rippled to and fro on the wealth of her gold hair. Her smooth forehead had the soft, pure sheen of a priceless pearl in the splendour of the sunset, mingling the gloom of starry spaces, the purple of the sea, and the crimson of the sky in a magnificent stillness. "No," she said slowly, "I never loved him. I think I never. He loves me, perhaps." The seduction of her slow voice died out of the air, and her raised eyes remained fixed on nothing, as if indifferent and without thought. "Ramirez told you he loved you?" asked Nostromo, restraining himself. "Ah, once, one evening." "The miserable! Ha!" He had jumped up as if stung by a gadfly and stood before her, mute with anger. "Misericordia divina, you too, Giambattista. Poor wretch that I am," she lamented in ingenuous tones. "I told Linda, and she scolded. Am I to live blind, dumb, and deaf in this world? And she told father, who took down his gun and cleaned it. Poor Ramirez. Then you came, and she told you." He looked at her. He fastened his eyes upon the hollow of her white throat, which had the invincible charm of things young, palpitating, delicate, and alive. Was this the child he had known? Was it possible? It dawned upon him that in these last years he had really seen very little, nothing of her, nothing. She had come into the world like a thing unknown. She had come upon him unawares. She was a danger, a frightful danger. The instinctive mood of fierce determination that had never failed him before the perils of this life added its steady force to the violence of his passion. She, in a voice that recalled to him the song of running water, the tinkling of a silver bell, continued, "And between you three you have brought me here into this captivity to the sky and water, nothing else, sky and water. Oh, Sanctissima Madre, my hair shall turn grey on this tedious island. I could hate you, Giambattista." He laughed loudly. Her voice enveloped him like a caress. She bemoaned her fate, spreading unconsciously like a flower its perfume in the coolness of the evening, the indefinable seduction of her person. Was it her fault that nobody ever had admired Linda? Even when they were little, going out with their mother to Mass, she remembered that people took no notice of Linda, who was fearless, and chose instead to frighten her, who was timid, with their attention. It was her hair like gold, she supposed. He broke out, "Your hair like gold, and your eyes like violets, and your lips like the rose, your round arms, your white throat." Imperturbable in the indolence of her pose, she blushed deeply all over to the roots of her hair. She was not conceited. She was no more self-conscious than a flower, but she was pleased, and perhaps even a flower loves to hear itself praised. He glanced down and added impetuously, "Your little feet." Leaning back against the rough stone wall of the cottage, she seemed to bask languidly in the warmth of the rosy flush. Only her lowered eyes glanced at her little feet. "And so you are going at last to marry Alinda. She is terrible. Ah, now she will understand better since you have told her you love her. She will not be so fierce." "Chica," said Nostromo, "I have not told her anything." "Then make haste. Come tomorrow. Come and tell her, so that I may have some peace from her scolding, and perhaps, who knows, be allowed to listen to your Ramirez, eh? Is that it? Your mercy of God, how violent you are, Giovanni, she said, unmoved. Who is Ramirez? Ramirez? Who is he? She repeated dreamily in the dusk and gloom of the clouded gulf, with a low red streak in the west like a hot bar of glowing iron laid across the entrance of a world sombre as a cavern where the magnificent Capitas de Cargadores had hidden his conquests of love and wealth. Listen, Giselle, he said in measured tones. I will tell no word of love to your sister. Do you want to know why? Alas, I could not understand, perhaps, Giovanni. Father says you are not like other men, that no one had ever understood you properly, that the rich will be surprised yet. Oh, saints in heaven, I am weary. She raised her embroidery to conceal the lower part of her face, then let it fall on her lap. The lantern was shaded on the land side, but slanting away from the dark column of the lighthouse, they could see the long shaft of light, kindled by Linda, go out to strike the expiring glow in a horizon of purple and red. Giselle Viola, with her head resting against the wall of the house, her eyes half closed and her little feet in white stockings and black slippers crossed over each other, seemed to surrender herself, tranquil and fatal, to the gathering dusk. The charm of her body, the promising mysteriousness of her indolence, went out into the night of the placid gulf like a fresh and intoxicating fragrance spreading out in the shadows, impregnating the air. The incorruptible Nostromo breathed her ambient seduction in the tumultuous heaving of his breast. Before leaving the harbour, he had thrown off the store clothing of Captain Fidanza for greater ease in the long pull out to the islands. He stood before her in the red sash and check shirt as he used to appear on the company's wharf, a Mediterranean sailor come ashore to try his luck in Costaguana. The dusk of purple and red enveloped him too, close, soft, profound, as no more than 50 yards from that spot it had gathered evening after evening about the self-destructive passion of Don Martin Decoud's utter scepticism, flaming up to death in solitude. You have got to hear, he began at last with perfect self-control. I shall say no word of love to your sister to whom I am betrothed from this evening, because it is you that I love. It is you. The dusk let him see yet the tender and voluptuous smile that came instinctively upon her lips, shaped for love and kisses, freeze hard in the drawn, haggard lines of terror. He could not restrain himself any longer. While she shrank from his approach, her arms went out to him, abandoned and regal in the dignity of her languid surrender. He held her head in his 2 hands and showered rapid kisses upon the upturned face that gleamed in the purple dusk. Masterful and tender, he was entering slowly upon the fullness of his possession, and he perceived that she was crying. Then the incomparable Capataz, the man of careless loves, became gentle and caressing like a woman to the grief of a child. He murmured to her fondly. He sat down by her and nursed her fair head on his breast. He called her his star and his little flower. It had grown dark. From the living room of the lightkeeper's cottage, where Giorgio, one of the immortal 1,000, was bending his leonine and heroic head over a charcoal fire, there came the sound of sizzling and the aroma of an artistic frittura. In the obscure disarray of that thing happening like a cataclysm, it was in her feminine head that some gleam of reason survived. He was lost to the world in their embraced stillness. But she said, whispering into his ear, God have mercy, what will become of me here, now, between this sky and this water I hate? Linda, Linda, I see her. She tried to get out of his arms, suddenly relaxed at the sound of that name. But there was no one approaching their black shapes, enlaced and struggling on the white background of the wall. Linda, poor Linda. I tremble. I shall die of fear before my poor sister Linda, betrothed today to Giovanni, my lover. Giovanni, you must have been mad. I cannot understand you. You are not like other men. I will not give you up, never, only to God himself. But why have you done this blind, mad, cruel, frightful thing? Released, she hung her head, let fall her hands. The altar cloth, as if tossed by a great wind, lay far away from them, gleaming white on the black ground. "From fear of losing my hope of you," said Nostromo. "You knew that you had my soul. You know everything. It was made for you. But what could stand between you and me? What? Tell me," she repeated without impatience, in superb assurance. "Your dead mother," he said, very low. "Ah, poor mother. She is a saint in heaven now, and I cannot give you up to her. No, Giovanni, only to God alone. You are mad, but it is done. Oh, what have you done? Giovanni, my beloved, my life, my master, do not leave me here in this grave of clouds. You cannot leave me now. You must take me away, at once, this instant, in the little boat. Giovanni, carry me off tonight from my fear of Linda's eyes, before I have to look at her again." She nestled close to him. The slave of the San Tome silver felt the weight as of chains upon his limbs, a pressure as of a cold hand upon his lips. He struggled against the spell. "I cannot," he said, "not yet. There is something that stands between us two and the freedom of the world." She pressed her form closer to his side with a subtle and naive instinct of seduction. "You rave, Giovanni, my lover," she whispered engagingly. "What can there be? Carry me off, in thy very hands, to Donna Amarilla, away from here. I am not very heavy." It seemed as though she expected him to lift her up at once in his two palms. She had lost the notion of all impossibility. Anything could happen on this night of wonder. As he made no movement, she almost cried aloud, "I tell you I am afraid of Linda." And still he did not move. She became quiet and wily. "What can there be?" she asked coaxingly. He felt her warm breathing, alive, quivering in the hollow of his arm, in the exulting consciousness of his strength and the triumphant excitement of his mind. He struck out for his freedom. "A treasure," he said. All was still. She did not understand. A treasure of silver, to buy a gold crown for thy brow." "A treasure?" she repeated, in a faint voice, as if from the depths of a dream. "What is it you say?" She disengaged herself gently. He got up and looked down at her, aware of her face, of her hair, her lips, the dimples on her cheeks, seeing the fascination of her person in the night of the gulf as if in the blaze of noonday. Her nonchalant and seductive voice trembled with the excitement of admiring awe and ungovernable curiosity. "A treasure of silver," she stammered out, then pressed on faster. "What? Where? How did you get it, Giovanni?" He wrestled with the spell of captivity. It was as if striking a heroic blow that he burst out, "Like a thief!" The densest blackness of the placid gulf seemed to fall upon his head. He could not see her now. She had vanished into a long, obscure, abysmal silence, whence her voice came back to him after a time with a faint glimmer, which was her face. "I love you. I love you." These words gave him an unwonted sense of freedom. They cast a spell stronger than the accursed spell of the treasure. They changed his weary subjection to that dead thing into an exulting conviction of his power. He would cherish her, he said, in a splendour as great as Donna Amarilla's. The rich lived on wealth stolen from the people, but he had taken from the rich nothing that was not lost to them already by their folly and their betrayal. For he had been betrayed, he said, deceived, tempted. She believed him. He had kept the treasure for purposes of revenge, but now he cared nothing for it. He cared only for her. He would put her beauty in a palace on a hill crowned with olive trees, a white palace above a blue sea. He would keep her there like a jewel in a casket. He would get land for her, her own land, fertile with vines and corn, to set her little feet upon. He kissed them. He had already paid for it all with the soul of a woman and the life of a man. The capataz de cargadores tasted the supreme intoxication of his generosity. He flung the mastered treasure superbly at her feet in the impenetrable darkness of the gulf, in the darkness defying, as men said, the knowledge of God and the wit of the devil. But she must let him grow rich first, he warned her. She listened as if in a trance. Her fingers stirred in his hair. He got up from his knees, reeling, weak, empty, as though he had flung his soul away. "Make haste, then," she said. "Make haste, Giovanni, my lover, my master, for I will give thee up to no one but God, and I am afraid of Linda." He guessed at her shudder and swore to do his best. He trusted the courage of her love. She promised to be brave in order to be loved always, far away in a white palace upon a hill above a blue sea. Then, with a timid, tentative eagerness, she murmured, "Where is it? Where? Tell me that, Giovanni." He opened his mouth and remained silent, thunderstruck. Not that," he gasped out, appalled at the spell of secrecy that had kept him dumb before so many people, falling upon his lips again with unimpaired force. Not even to her. Not even to her. It was too dangerous. "I forbid thee to ask," he cried at her, deadening cautiously the anger of his voice. He had not regained his freedom. The spectre of the unlawful treasure arose, standing by her side like a figure of silver, pitiless and secret, with a finger on its pale lips. His soul died within him at the vision of himself creeping in presently along the ravine, with the smell of earth, of damp foliage in his nostrils, creeping in, determined in a purpose that numbed his breast, and creeping out again, loaded with silver, with his ears alert to every sound. It must be done on this very night, that work of a craven slave. He stooped low, pressed the hem of her skirt to his lips with a muttered command. "Tell him I would not stay," and was gone suddenly from her, silent, without as much as a footfall in the dark night. She sat still, her head resting indolently against the wall, and her little feet in white stockings and black slippers crossed over each other. Old Giorgio, coming out, did not seem to be surprised at the intelligence as much as she had vaguely feared, for she was full of inexplicable fear now, fear of everything and everybody except of her Giovanni and his treasure. But that was incredible. The heroic Garibaldino accepted Nostromo's abrupt departure with a sagacious indulgence. He remembered his own feelings and exhibited a masculine penetration of the true state of the case. "Va bene, let him go. Ha ha! No matter how fair the woman, it galls a little. Liberty, there's more than one kind. He has said the great word, and San Giambattista is not tame." He seemed to be instructing the motionless and scared Giselle. "A man should not be tame," he added dogmatically out of the doorway. Her stillness and silence seemed to displease him. "Do not give way to enviousness of your sister's lot," he admonished her, very grave, in his deep voice. Presently he had to come to the door again to call in his younger sister. It was late. He shouted her name 3 times before she even moved her head. Left alone, she had become the helpless prey of astonishment. She walked into the bedroom she shared with Linda like a person profoundly asleep. That aspect was so marked that even old Giorgio, spectacled, raising his eyes from the Bible, shook his head as she shut the door behind her. She walked right across the room without looking at anything and sat down at once by the open window. Linda, stealing down from the tower in the exuberance of her happiness, found her with a lighted candle at her back, facing the black night, full of sighing gusts of wind and the sound of distant showers. A true night of the Gulf, too dense for the eye of God and the wiles of the devil. She did not turn her head at the opening of the door. There was something in that immobility which reached Linda in the depths of her paradise. The older sister guessed angrily. The child is thinking of that wretched Ramirez. Linda longed to talk. She said in her arbitrary voice, "Giselle," and was not answered by the slightest movement. That girl that was going to live in a palace and walk on ground of her own was ready to die with terror. Not for anything in the world would she have turned her head to face her sister. Her heart was beating madly. She said with subdued haste, "Do not speak to me, I am praying." Linda, disappointed, went out quietly, and Giselle sat on unbelieving, lost, dazed, patient, as if waiting for the confirmation of the incredible. The hopeless blackness of the clouds seemed part of a dream too. She waited. She did not wait in vain. The man whose soul was dead within him, creeping out of the ravine, weighted with silver, had seen the gleam of the lighted window, and could not help retracing his steps from the beach. On that impenetrable background, obliterating the lofty mountains by the seaboard, she saw the slave of the San Tome silver, as if by an extraordinary power of a miracle. She accepted his return, as if henceforth the world could hold no surprise for all eternity. She rose, compelled and rigid, and began to speak long before the light from within fell upon the face of the approaching man. "You have come back to carry me off. It is well. Open thy arms, Giovanni, my lover, I am coming." His prudent footsteps stopped, and with his eyes glistening wildly, he spoke in a harsh voice. "Not yet. I must grow rich slowly." A threatening note came into his tone. "Do not forget that you have a thief for your lover." "Yes, yes," she whispered hastily. "Come nearer. Listen. Do not give me up, Giovanni. Never, never. I will be patient." Her form drooped consolingly over the low casement towards the slave of the unlawful treasure. The light in the room went out, and, weighted with silver, the magnificent capataz clasped her round her white neck in the darkness of the gulf as a drowning man clutches at a straw. End of Part 3rd, The Lighthouse, Chapter 12. Part 3rd of Nostromo by Joseph Conrad, The Lighthouse, Chapter 13. This librivox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dann. Part 3rd, The Lighthouse, Chapter 13. On the day Mrs. Gould was going, in Dr. Moningham's words, to give a tertulia, Captain Fidanza went down the side of his schooner lying in Sulaco Harbour, calm, unbending, deliberate in the way he sat down in his dinghy and took up his sculls. He was later than usual. The afternoon was well advanced before he landed on the beach of the Great Isabel, and with a steady pace climbed the slope of the island. From a distance he made out Giselle sitting in a chair tilted back against the end of the house, under the window of the girls' room. She had her embroidery in her hands and held it well up to her eyes. The tranquillity of that girlish figure exasperated the feeling of perpetual struggle and strife he carried in his breast. He became angry. It seemed to him that she ought to hear the clanking of his fetters, his silver fetters, from afar. And, while ashore that day, he had met the doctor with the evil eye, who had looked at him very hard. The raising of her eyes mollified him. They smiled in their flower-like freshness straight upon his heart. Then she frowned. It was a warning to be cautious. He stopped some distance away, and in a loud, indifferent tone said, "Good day, Giselle. Is Linda up yet?" "Yes, she is in the big room with father." He approached then, and looking through the window into the bedroom, for fear of being detected by Linda returning there for some reason, he said, moving only his lips, "You love me?" "More than my life." She went on with her embroidery under his contemplating gaze, and continued to speak, looking at her work. "Or I could not live. I could not, Giovanni, for this life is like death. Oh, Giovanni, I shall perish if you do not take me away. He smiled carelessly. I will come to the window when it's dark, he said. No, don't, Giovanni, not tonight. Linda and father have been talking together for a long time today. What about? Ramirez, I fancy, I heard. I do not know. I am afraid. I am always afraid. It is like dying 1,000 times a day. Your love is to me like your treasure to you. It is there, but I can never get enough of it. He looked at her very still. She was beautiful. His desire had grown within him. He had 2 masters now, but she was incapable of sustained emotion. She was sincere in what she said, but she slept placidly at night. When she saw him, she flamed up, always. Then only an increased taciturnity marked the change in her. She was afraid of betraying herself. She was afraid of pain, of bodily harm, of sharp words, of facing anger and witnessing violence. For her soul was light and tender, with a pagan sincerity in its impulses. She murmured, "Give up the palazzo, Giovanni, and the vineyard on the hills for which we are starving our love." She ceased, seeing Linda standing silent at the corner of the house. Nostromo turned to his affianced wife with a greeting, and was amazed at her sunken eyes, at her hollow cheeks, at the air of illness and anguish in her face. "Have you been ill?" he asked, trying to put some concern into this question. Her black eyes blazed at him. "Am I thinner?" she asked. "Yes, perhaps, a little." "And older?" "Every day counts for all of us." "I shall go grey, I fear, before the ring is on my finger," she said, slowly keeping her gaze fastened upon him. She waited for what he would say, rolling down her turned-up sleeves. "No fear of that," he said absently. She turned away as if it had been something final, and busied herself with household cares while Nostromo talked with her father. Conversation with the old Garibaldino was not easy. Age had left his faculties unimpaired, only they seemed to have withdrawn somewhere deep within him. His answers were slow in coming, with an effect of august gravity. But that day he was more animated, quicker. There seemed to be more life in the old lion. He was uneasy for the integrity of his honour. He believed Sidoni's warning as to Ramirez's designs upon his younger daughter, and he did not trust her. She was flighty. He said nothing of his cares to son Gian Battista. It was a touch of senile vanity. He wanted to show he was equal yet to the task of guarding alone the honour of his house. Nostromo went away early. As soon as he had disappeared, walking towards the beach, Linda stepped over the threshold and, with a haggard smile, sat down by the side of her father. Ever since that Sunday when the infatuated and desperate Ramirez had waited for her on the wharf, she had no doubts whatever. The jealous ravings of that man were no revelation. They had only fixed with precision, as with a nail driven into her heart, that sense of unreality and deception which, instead of bliss and security, she had found in her intercourse with her promised husband. She had passed on, pouring indignation and scorn upon Ramirez, but that Sunday she nearly died of wretchedness and shame, lying on the carved and lettered stone of Teresa's grave, subscribed for by the engine drivers and the fitters of the railway workshops, in sign of their respect for the hero of Italian unity. Old Viola had not been able to carry out his desire of burying his wife in the sea, and Linda wept upon the stone. The gratuitous outrage appalled her. If he wished to break her heart, well and good. Everything was permitted to Gian Battista, but why trample upon the pieces? Why seek to humiliate her spirit? Ah, he could not break that. She dried her tears. And Giselle, the little one that, ever since she could toddle, had always clung to her skirt for protection. What duplicity! But she could not help it, probably. When there was a man in the case, the poor feather-headed wretch could not help herself. Linda had a good share of the Viola stoicism. She resolved to say nothing. But womanlike, she put passion into her stoicism. Giselle's short answers, prompted by fearful caution, drove her beside herself by their curtness that resembled disdain. One day she flung herself upon the chair in which her indolent sister was lying and impressed the mark of her teeth at the base of the whitest neck in Sulaco. Giselle cried out, but she had her share of the viola heroism. Ready to faint with terror, she only said in a lazy voice, "Madre de Dios, are you going to eat me alive, Linda?" And this outburst passed off, leaving no trace upon the situation. She knows nothing, she cannot know anything, reflected Giselle. Perhaps it is not true, it cannot be true, Linda tried to persuade herself. But when she saw Captain Fidanza for the first time after her meeting with the distracted Ramirez, the certitude of her misfortune returned. She watched him from the doorway go away to his boat, asking herself stoically, "Will they meet tonight?" She made up her mind not to leave the tower for a second. When he had disappeared, she came out and sat down by her father. The venerable Garibaldino felt, in his own words, a young man yet. In one way or another, a good deal of talk about Ramirez had reached him of late, and his contempt and dislike of that man, who obviously was not what his son would have been, had made him restless. He slept very little now, but for several nights past, instead of reading or only sitting with Mrs. Gould's silver spectacles on his nose before the open Bible, he had been prowling actively all about the island with his old gun, on watch over his honour. Linda, laying her thin brown hand on his knee, tried to soothe his excitement. Ramirez was not in Sulaco. Nobody knew where he was. He was gone. His talk of what he would do meant nothing. "No," the old man interrupted, "but San Gian Battista told me quite of himself that the cowardly esclavo was drinking and gambling with the rascals of Zapiga over there on the north side of the Gulf. He may get some of the worst scoundrels of that scoundrelly town of Negroes to help him in his attempt upon the little one. But I am not so old, no." She argued earnestly against the probability of any attempt being made, and at last the old man fell silent, chewing his white moustache. Women had their obstinate notions which must be humoured. His poor wife was like that, and Linda resembled her mother. It was not seemly for a man to argue. Maybe, he mumbled. She was by no means easy in her mind. She loved Nostromo. She turned her eyes upon Giselle, sitting at a distance, with something of maternal tenderness and the jealous anguish of a rival outraged in her defeat. Then she rose and walked over to her. "Listen, you," she said roughly. The invincible candour of the gaze, raised up all violet and dew, excited her rage and admiration. She had beautiful eyes, the chica, this vile thing of white flesh and black deception. She did not know whether she wanted to tear them out with shouts of vengeance or cover up their mysterious and shameless innocence with kisses of pity and love. And suddenly they became empty, gazing blankly at her, except for a little fear not quite buried deep enough with all the other emotions in Giselle's heart. Linda said, "Ramirez is boasting in town that he will carry you off from the island." "What folly," answered the other, and in a perversity bought of long restraint she added, "He is not the man," in a jesting tone with a trembling audacity. "No," said Linda through her clenched teeth. "Is he not? Well, then, look to it, because father has been walking around with a loaded gun at night." "It is not good for him. You must tell him not to, Linda. He will not listen to me." "I shall say nothing, never any more, to anybody," cried Linda passionately. This could not last, thought Giselle. Giovanni must take her away soon, the very next time he came. She would not suffer these terrors for ever so much silver. To speak with her sister made her ill, but she was not uneasy at her father's watchfulness. She had begged Nostromo not to come to the window that night. He had promised to keep away for this once, and she did not know, could not guess or imagine that he had another reason for coming on the island. Linda had gone straight to the tower. It was time to light up. She unlocked the little door and went heavily up the spiral staircase, carrying her love for the magnificent Capataz de Cargadores like an ever-increasing load of shameful fetters. No, she could not throw it off. No, let heaven dispose of these two. And moving about the lantern, filled with twilight and the sheen of the moon, with careful movements, she lighted the lamp. Then her arms fell along her body. "And with our mother looking on," she murmured, "my own sister, the chica." The whole refracting apparatus, with its brass fittings and rings of prisms, glittered and sparkled like a dome-shaped shrine of diamonds, containing not a lamp but some sacred flame dominating the sea. And Linda, the keeper, in black, with a pale face, drooped low in a wooden chair, alone with her jealousy, far above the shames and passions of the earth. A strange, dragging pain, as if somebody were pulling her about brutally by her dark hair with bronze glints, made her put her hands up to her temples. They would meet. They would meet. And she knew where too. At the window. The sweat of torture fell in drops on her cheeks, while the moonlight in the offing closed, as if with a colossal bar of silver, the entrance of the placid gulf, the sombre cavern of clouds and stillness in the surf-fretted seaboard. Linda Viola stood up suddenly with a finger on her lip. He loved neither her nor her sister. The whole thing seemed so objectless as to frighten her and also give her some hope. Why did he not carry her off? What prevented him? He was incomprehensible. What were they waiting for? For what end were these two lying and deceiving? Not for the ends of their love. There was no such thing. The hope of regaining him for herself made her break her vow of not leaving the tower that night. She must talk at once to her father, who was wise and would understand. She ran down the spiral stairs. At the moment of opening the door at the bottom, she heard the sound of the first shot ever fired on the Great Isabel. She felt a shock, as though the bullet had struck her breast. She ran on without pausing. The cottage was dark. She cried at the door, "Giselle! Giselle!" then dashed round the corner and screamed her sister's name at the open window without getting an answer. But as she was rushing, distracted, round the house, Giselle came out of the door and darted past her, running silently, her hair loose and her eyes staring straight ahead. She seemed to skim along the grass as if on tiptoe, and vanished. Linda walked on slowly with her arms stretched out before her. All was still on the island. She did not know where she was going. The tree under which Martin Descoues spent his last days, beholding life like a succession of senseless images, threw a large blotch of black shade upon the grass. Suddenly she saw her father standing quietly all alone in the moonlight. The Garibaldino, big, erect, with his snow-white hair and beard, had a monumental repose in his immobility, leaning upon a rifle. She put her hand upon his arm lightly. He never stirred. "What have you done?" she asked in her ordinary voice. "I have shot Ramirez, infame," he answered, with his eyes directed to where the shade was blackest. "Like a thief he came, and like a thief he fell. The child had to be protected." He did not offer to move an inch, to advance a single step. He stood there, rugged and unstirring, like a statue of an old man guarding the honour of his house. Linda removed her trembling hand from his arm, firm and steady like an arm of stone, and without a word entered the blackness of the shade. She saw a stir of formless shapes on the ground and stopped short. A murmur of despair and tears grew louder to her strained hearing. "I entreated you not to come tonight, Alma Giovanni, and you promised. Oh, why did you come, Giovanni?" It was her sister's voice. It broke on a heart-rending sob. And the voice of the resourceful Capataz de Cargadores, master and slave of the San Tome treasure, who had been caught unawares by old Giorgio while stealing across the open towards the ravine to get some more silver, answered careless and cool, but sounding startlingly weak from the ground. It seemed as though I could not live through the night without seeing thee once more, my star, my little flower. The brilliant tertulio was just over. The last guests had departed, and the Senor Administrador had gone to his room already, where Dr. Monaghan, who had been expected in the evening but had not turned up, arrived, driving along the wood-block pavement under the electric lamps of the deserted Calle de la Constitucion, and found the great gateway of the Casa still open. He limped in, stumped up the stairs, and found the fat and sleek Basilio on the point of turning off the lights in the sala. The prosperous major-domo remained open-mouthed at this late invasion. "Don't put out the lights," commanded the doctor. "I want to see the Senora." "The Senora is in the Senor Administrador's Cancellaria," said Basilio in an unctuous voice. "The Senor Administrador starts for the mountain in an hour. There is some trouble with the workmen to be feared, it appears. A shameless people without reason and decency. And idle, Senor, idle." "You are shamelessly lazy and imbecile yourself," said the doctor, with that faculty for exasperation which made him so generally beloved. "Don't put the lights out." Basilio retired with dignity. Dr. Monaghan, waiting in the brilliantly lighted sala, heard presently a door close at the further end of the house. A jingle of spurs died out. The Senor Administrador was off to the mountain. With a measured swish of her long train, flashing with jewels and the shimmer of silk, her delicate head bowed as if under the weight of a mass of fair hair in which the silver threads were lost. The First Lady of Sulaco, as Captain Mitchell used to describe her, moved along the lighted corridor, wealthy beyond great dreams of wealth, considered, loved, respected, honoured, and as solitary as any human being had ever been, perhaps, on this earth. The doctor's "Mrs. Gould, 1 minute," stopped her with a start at the door of the lighted and empty sala. From the similarity of mood and circumstance, the sight of the doctor, standing there all alone amongst the groups of furniture, recalled to her emotional memory her unexpected meeting with Martin Decoud. She seemed to hear, in the silence, the voice of that man, dead miserably so many years ago, pronounce the words, "Antonia left her fan here." But it was the doctor's voice that spoke, a little altered by his excitement. She remarked his shining eyes. "Mrs. Gould, you are wanted. Do you know what has happened? You remember what I told you yesterday about Nostromo? Well, it seems that a lancha, a decked boat coming from Zapiga with 4 negroes in her, passing close to the Great Isabel, was hailed from the cliff by a woman's voice, Linda's as a matter of fact, commanding them, it's a moonlight night, to go round to the beach and take up a wounded man to the town. The patron from whom I've heard all this, of course, did so at once. He told me that when they got round to the low side of the Great Isabel, they found Linda Viola waiting for them. They followed her. She led them under a tree not far from the cottage, and there they found Nostromo lying on the ground, with his head in the younger girl's lap, and Father Viola standing some distance off, leaning on his gun. Under Linda's direction they got a table out of the cottage for a stretcher, after breaking off the legs. They are here, Mrs. Gould. I mean Nostromo and Giselle. The negroes brought him in to the first aid hospital near the harbour. He made the attendant send for me, but it was not me he wanted to see. It was you, Mrs. Gould. It was you." "Me?" whispered Mrs. Gould, shrinking a little. "Yes, you," the doctor burst out. "He begged me, his enemy as he thinks, to bring you to him at once. It seems he has something to say to you alone." "Impossible," murmured Mrs. Gould. "He said to me, 'Remind her that I have done something to keep a roof over her head.'" "Mrs. Gould," the doctor pursued, in the greatest excitement, "do you remember the silver in the lighter that was lost?" Mrs. Gould remembered, but she did not say she hated the mere mention of that silver. Frankness personified, she remembered with an exaggerated horror that for the first and last time of her life she had concealed the truth from her husband about that very silver. She had been corrupted by her fears at that time, and she had never forgiven herself. Moreover, that silver, which would never have come down if her husband had been made acquainted with the news brought by Decoud, had been, in a roundabout way, nearly the cause of Dr. Moningham's death, and these things appeared to her very dreadful. "Was it lost, though?" the doctor exclaimed. "I've always felt that there was a mystery about our Nostromo ever since. I do believe he wants now at the point of death." "The point of death," repeated Mrs. Gould. Yes. He wants perhaps to tell you something concerning that silver which—" "Oh, no," exclaimed Mrs. Gould in a low voice. "Isn't it lost and done with? Isn't there enough treasure without it to make everybody in the world miserable?" The doctor remained still in a submissive, disappointed silence. At last he ventured, very low, "And there is that viola girl, Giselle. What are we to do? It looks as though father and sister had—" Mrs. Gould admitted that she felt in duty bound to do her best for these girls. "I have a volante here," the doctor said, "if you don't mind getting into that." He waited, all impatience, till Mrs. Gould reappeared, having thrown over her dress a grey cloak with a deep hood. It was thus that, cloaked and monastically hooded over her evening costume, this woman, full of endurance and compassion, stood by the side of the bed on which the splendid Capataz de Cargadores lay stretched out motionless on his back. The whiteness of sheets and pillows gave a sombre and energetic relief to his bronzed face, to the dark, nervous hands, so good on a tiller, upon a bridle and on a trigger, lying open and idle upon a white coverlet. "She is innocent," the Capataz was saying in a deep and level voice, as though afraid that a louder word would break the slender hold his spirit still kept upon his body. "She is innocent. It is I alone. But no matter. For these things I would answer to no man or woman alive." He paused. Mrs. Gould's face, very white within the shadow of the hood, bent over him with an invincible and dreary sadness. And the low sobs of Giselle Viola, kneeling at the end of the bed, her gold hair with coppery gleams loose and scattered over the Capataz's feet, hardly troubled the silence of the room. "Ah, old Giorgio, the guardian of thy nonna! Fancy the vecchio coming upon me so light of foot, so steady of aim. I myself could have done no better. But the price of a charge of powder might have been saved. The honour was safe. Signora, she would have followed to the end of the world Nostromo the thief. I have said the word. The spell is broken." A low moan from the girl made him cast his eyes down. "I cannot see her. No matter," he went on, with the shadow of the old magnificent carelessness in his voice. "One kiss is enough if there is no time for more. An airy soul, Signora, bright and warm like sunshine, soon clouded and soon serene. They would crush it there between them. Signora, cast on her the eye of your compassion, as famed from one end of the land to the other as the courage and daring of the man who speaks to you. She will console herself in time. And even Ramirez is not a bad fellow. I am not angry, no. It is not Ramirez who overcame the Capataz of the Sulaco Cargadores." He paused, made an effort, and in a louder voice, a little wildly, declared, "I die, betrayed by—" But he did not say by whom or by what he was dying betrayed. "She would not have betrayed me," he began again, opening his eyes very wide. "She was faithful. We were going very far. Very soon I could have torn myself away from that accursed treasure for her. For that child I would have left boxes and boxes of it full. And Decoud took four ingots. Why? Picardia, to betray me? How could I give back the treasure with 4 ingots missing? They would have said I had purloined them. The doctor would have said that. Alas, it holds me yet." Mrs. Gould bent low, fascinated, cold with apprehension. "What became of Don Martin on that night, Nostromo?" "Who knows? I wondered what would become of me. Now I know. Death was to come upon me unawares. He went away. He betrayed me. And you think I have killed him? You are all alike, you fine people. The silver has killed me. It has held me. It holds me yet. Nobody knows where it is. But you are the wife of Don Carlos, who put it into my hands and said, "Save it on your life." And when I returned and you all thought it was lost, what do I hear? It was nothing of importance. Let it go. Up, Nostromo, the faithful, and ride away to save us for dear life. Nostromo, Mrs. Gould whispered, bending very low. I too have hated the idea of that silver from the bottom of my heart. Marvellous that one of you should hate the wealth that you know so well how to take from the hands of the poor. The world rests upon the poor, as old Giorgio says. You have been always good to the poor, but there is something accursed in wealth. Signora, shall I tell you where the treasure is? To you alone, shining, incorruptible. A pained, involuntary reluctance lingered in his tone, in his eyes, plain to the woman with the genius of sympathetic intuition. She averted her glance from the miserable subjection of the dying man, appalled, wishing to hear no more of the silver. No, Capataz, she says, no one misses it now. Let it be lost forever. After hearing these words, Nostromo closed his eyes, uttered no word, made no movement. Outside the door of the sick room, Dr. Monaghan, excited to the highest pitch, his eyes shining with eagerness, came up to the two women. "Now, Mrs. Gould," he said almost brutally in his impatience, "tell me, was I right? There is a mystery. You have got the word of it, have you not? He told you?" "He told me nothing," said Mrs. Gould steadily. The light of his temperamental enmity to Nostromo went out of Dr. Monaghan's eyes. He stepped back submissively. He did not believe Mrs. Gould, but her word was law. He accepted her denial like an inexplicable fatality, affirming the victory of Nostromo's genius over his own. Even before that woman, whom he loved with secret devotion, he had been defeated by the magnificent Capataz de Cargadores, the man who had lived his own life on the assumption of unbroken fidelity, rectitude, and courage. "Pray send at once somebody for my carriage," spoke Mrs. Gould from within her hood. Then, turning to Giselle Viola, "Come nearer me, child, come closer. We will wait here." Giselle Viola, heartbroken and childlike, her face veiled in her falling hair, crept up to her side. Mrs. Gould slipped her hand through the arm of the unworthy daughter of old Viola, the immaculate republican, the hero without a stain. Slowly, gradually, as a withered flower droops, the head of the girl who would have followed a thief to the end of the world rested on the shoulder of Donna Emilia, the First Lady of Sulaco, the wife of the Senor Administrador of the San Tome mine. And Mrs. Gould, feeling her suppressed sobbing, nervous and excited, had the first and only moment of bitterness in her life. It was worthy of Dr. Monaghan himself. "Console yourself, child. Very soon he would have forgotten you for his treasure." "Signora, he loved me," Giselle whispered despairingly. "He loved me as no one has ever been loved before." "I have been loved too," Mrs. Gould said in a severe tone. Giselle clung to her convulsively. "Oh, Signora, but you shall live adored to the end of your life," she sobbed out. Mrs. Gould kept an unbroken silence till the carriage arrived. She helped in the half-fainting girl. After the doctor had shut the door of the landau, she leaned over to him. "You can do nothing?" she whispered. "No, Mrs. Gould. Moreover, he won't let us touch him. It does not matter. I just had one look. Useless." But he promised to see old Viola and the other girl that very night. He could get the police boat to take him off to the island. He remained in the street, looking after the landau rolling away slowly behind the white mules. The rumour of some accident, an accident to Captain Fidanza, had been spreading along the new quays with their rows of lamps and the dark shapes of towering cranes. A knot of night prowlers, the poorest of the poor, hung about the door of the first aid hospital, whispering in the moonlight of the empty street. There was no one with the wounded man but the pale photographer, small, frail, bloodthirsty, the hater of capitalists, perched on a high stool near the head of the bed with his knees up and his chin in his hands. He had been fetched by a comrade who, working late on the wharf, had heard from a negro belonging to a lancha that Captain Fidanza had been brought ashore, mortally wounded. "Have you any dispositions to make, comrade?" he asked anxiously. "Do not forget that we want money for our work. The rich must be fought with their own weapons." Nostromo made no answer. The other did not insist, remaining huddled up on the stool, shock-headed, wildly hairy, like a hunched-back monkey. Then, after a long silence, "Comrade Fidanza," he began solemnly, "you have refused all aid from that doctor. Is he really a dangerous enemy of the people?" In the dimly lit room, Nostromo rolled his head slowly on the pillow and opened his eyes, directing at the weird figure perched by his bedside a glance of enigmatic and profound inquiry. Then his head rolled back, his eyelids fell, and the Capataz de Cargadores died without a word or moan after an hour of immobility, broken by short shudders testifying to the most atrocious sufferings. Dr. Monaghan, going out in the police galley to the islands, beheld the glitter of the moon upon the gulf and the high black shape of the great Isabel sending the shaft of light afar from under the canopy of clouds. "Poor lazy," he said, wondering what he would find there. He tried to imagine Linda and her father, and discovered a strange reluctance within himself. "Poor lazy," he repeated. From the moment he fired at the thief of his honour, Giorgio Viola had not stirred from the spot. He stood, his old gun grounded, his hand grasping the barrel near the muzzle. After the lancha carrying off Nostromo forever from her had left the shore, Linda, coming up, stopped before him. He did not seem to be aware of her presence, but when, losing her forced calmness, she cried out, "Do you know whom you have killed?" he answered, "Ramirez, the vagabond." White and staring insanely at her father, Linda laughed in his face. After a time he joined her faintly in a deep-toned and distant echo of her peals. Then she stopped, and the old man spoke as if startled. He cried out in San Gianbattista's voice. The gun fell from his opened hand, but the arm remained extended for a moment as if still supported. Linda seized it roughly. "You are too old to understand. Come into the house." He let her lead him. On the threshold he stumbled heavily, nearly coming to the ground together with his daughter. His excitement, his activity of the last few days, had been like the flare of a dying lamp. He caught at the back of his chair. "In San Giambattista's voice," he repeated in a severe tone. "I heard him, Ramirez, the miserable." Linda helped him into the chair and, bending low, hissed into his ear, "You have killed Gian Battista." The old man smiled under his thick moustache. Women had strange fancies. "Where is the child?" he asked, surprised at the penetrating chilliness of the air and the unwonted dimness of the lamp by which he used to sit up half the night with the open Bible before him. Linda hesitated a moment, then averted her eyes. "She is asleep," she said. "We shall talk of her tomorrow." She could not bear to look at him. He filled her with terror and with an almost unbearable feeling of pity. She had observed the change that came over him. He would never understand what he had done, and even to her the whole thing remained incomprehensible. He said with difficulty, "Give me the book." Linda laid on the table the closed volume in its worn leather cover, the Bible given him ages ago by an Englishman in Palermo. "The child had to be protected," he said in a strange, mournful voice. Behind his chair, Linda wrung her hands, crying, without noise. Suddenly she started for the door. He heard her move. "Where are you going?" he asked. "To the light," she answered, turning round to look at him balefully. "The light. See. Duty." Very upright, white-haired, leonine, heroic in his absorbed quietness, he felt in the pocket of his red shirt for the spectacles given him by Donna Amarilla. He put them on. After a long period of immobility, he opened the book and, from on high, looked through the glasses at the small print in double columns. A rigid, stern expression settled upon his features with a slight frown, as if in response to some gloomy thought or unpleasant sensation. But he never detached his eyes from the book while he swayed forward, gently, gradually, till his snow-white head rested upon the open pages. A wooden clock ticked methodically on the whitewashed wall, and growing slowly cold, the garibaldino lay alone, rugged, undecayed, like an old oak uprooted by a treacherous gust of wind. The light of the Great Isabel burned unfailing above the lost treasure of the San Tome mine. Into the bluish sheen of a night without stars, the lantern sent out a yellow beam towards the far horizon. Like a black speck upon the shining panes, Linda, crouching in the outer gallery, rested her head on the rail. The moon, drooping in the western board, looked at her radiantly. Below, at the foot of the cliff, the regular splash of oars from a passing boat ceased, and Dr. Monaghan stood up in the stern sheets. "Linda!" he shouted, throwing back his head. "Linda!" Linda stood up. She had recognized the voice. "Is he dead?" she cried, bending over. "Yes, my poor girl, I'm coming round," the doctor answered from below. "Pull to the beach," he said to the rowers. Linda's black figure detached itself upright on the light of the lantern, with her arms raised above her head as though she were going to throw herself over. "It is I who loved you," she whispered, with a face as set and white as marble in the moonlight. "I, only I. She will forget thee, killed miserably for her pretty face. I cannot understand. But I shall never forget thee, never." She stood silent and still, collecting her strength to throw all her fidelity, her pain, bewilderment, and despair into one great cry. "Never, Giambattista!" Dr. Monaghan, pulling round in the police galley, heard the name pass over his head. It was another of Nostromo's triumphs, the greatest, the most enviable, the most sinister of all. In that true cry of undying passion that seemed to ring aloud from Punta Mala to Azuera and away to the bright line of the horizon, overhung by a big white cloud shining like a mass of solid silver. The genius of the magnificent Capataz de Cargadores dominated the dark gulf containing his conquests of treasure and love. End of Part 3rd, The Lighthouse, Chapter 13. End of Nostromo by Joseph Conrad.